So I think you probably would agree Diego Rivera is probably the most famous Mexican muralist, or probably at least is the person a lot of people think about. And I think some of that has to do with the quality of his work, maybe the refinement from spending so much time studying art from old masters, but also growing up with a lot of artistic training and showing a lot of artistic promise from an early age, and also having Frida Kahlo as a sort of partner in crime, a romantic, wife and fellow artist. I think really just takes his work over the top, and of course, the story of his life becomes all the more interesting. I think having another major, even more probably now more famous artist as this sort of critic, and supporter. So you see, he's a little younger than Orozco, but not much. And this painting, I think itself, this portrait he did, goes to one of the important things I want to point out about this sort of emotional question. And just as an artist, you'll notice this too when it comes to painting. There's a difference between one painting on an easel and painting on a mural. That's one we've talked about and we'll talk about more. But also, when you're painting on an easel, you can look at something that you're painting, as in this is called naturalism, when you're painting from life or drawing from life. And so if I'm reacting to something I see, maybe it's a maybe I'm have a friend sit down and I'm painting them, or maybe I'm painting a still life, or maybe I'm painting a squirrel or a rabbit or whatever. You're going to react to the light hitting the object, the subject. You're going to react to the sort of physical presence of that which you're painting. And there's a difference between that, which is sort of painting from life, and painting from your head, or maybe even applying the rules and techniques of painting from life to painting something that's not necessarily from life. And I point this out because maybe if you're painting a mural, you might not necessarily be able to paint from life, because maybe the mural itself is so big, having someone sit for you right there, maybe it's hard to replicate the lighting that you want. So you will probably, in many cases, end up painting not from life, but maybe painting from a photograph, or painting using the rules of painting from life and transferring those to the mural, but maybe losing some of that life that you see in a painting like this, where you can really feel that Diego Rivera is kind of looking at maybe himself in the mirror, or at himself in a photograph, and preserving some of that sort of spontaneous reaction to the changes and the physical realities of light hitting the face, and the sort of luminosity of light. And this is the kind of a somewhat not a major thing, but something important to think about when it comes to this question of emotion, because I think there's a lot more emotion. And you can think about drawing, in your own experience, drawing an object that you see in front of you, and it can be a book, it can be something it doesn't need to be something, like a person, it can be anything, and comparing that to a drawing you make of the same subject without looking at it. And one will end up having a lot more of the sort of details and the kind of the things that your brain might not necessarily be aware of when you're drawing from life. Things like highlights, things like shadows, things like little details that you might not have remembered. So this is something important when it comes to painting on an easel, or even sketching or drawing or painting smaller scale, but reacting to something you're looking at, versus painting on a mural, where perhaps you're kind of using those techniques, but you lose a little bit of something. And I think this is a good way of starting off presenting Diego Rivera, who is a wonderful painter, because you could see in this scale, he's really painting from life and preserving all that light and luminosity. But it's a big thing. It's an important thing to think about. How do you translate? How do you go from being an easel painter, painting one on one, painting a subject, to painting big public political subject matter? And what do you lose along the way, and what do you gain along the way? But more importantly, how do you preserve a sense of emotional connection with the audience at such a big scale? And you might think of that emotional connection being in terms of the expressiveness of the brushstroke or the subject matter, but also the sort of feeling of one-on-oneness that you get just by the scale of an easel, which is almost the same scale as like a window, and feels very much like the scale of a human scale, 1-to-1, versus a mural, which is almost like a godlike scale, like a public scale, a sort of societal scale. And how do you, or do you even want to, preserve a sense of one-on-one emotional connection with the viewer at such a scale? And I think that really is an interesting question for me, at least, when I look at Diego Rivera's paintings and I compare them with someone like Orozco. And it goes back to this question of how do you make subject matter and how do you maybe relate to the audience at such a big scale when you're painting murals. And it's a wonderful sort of exploration because we don't really see painting at this scale except for hundreds of years prior in Europe and perhaps other places like we've seen in Central America, the Bonampak Maya murals. But I think this idea of making something this big and tailoring the execution and the subject matter to the scale rather than just treating the scale as an afterthought, it really goes to the heart of why abstract expressionist artists after this era, after World War II, in the 1940s, really embraced this large scale as sort of the fitting scale of modern life, modern scale, modern big, but also sort of expressionism. And I think when people talk about abstract expressionism, they focus on the abstract part and they don't think about the importance of expressionism, but also expressionism at a big scale. And how do you have an emotional connection at a large scale? And so let's see how Diego Rivera tackles this, because for me, and I'm not saying you should feel the same way, but I do think that the thing I find absent from his work that I find very present in Orozco is this sort of emotional body, a very emotional use of the physical body. And I think he sort of struggles with sort of finding a balance between, well, what we see as sort of his approach to mural making and maintaining that sense of maybe a one-on-one connection or an emotional connection to the viewer. So let's see how that plays out as we look at his early part of his career. And I imagine we'll probably not get too far past one or two of his early murals, but that'll get our feet wet. And so we'll pick up on him later. So here are our three muralists. And even this shows you exactly what I'm talking about. We haven't looked at Siqueiros, but even this example and Orozco show you they're using some of the rules of painting from life, volume, varying kind of colors to show you volume and depth. But you notice the first two aren't necessarily reacting from life. They might be, maybe the Siqueiros more, but you really feel the Orozco, the Rivera painting is definitely him kind of looking at himself and translating all that light, the warmth. And when you paint a mural, you're probably not going to be looking at all the subjects you're looking at, because when there's so many subjects, you're putting all kinds of things onto the mural, and it's going to be hard for you sitting on the top of a scaffold to look down at someone sitting there. So I think a lot of the murals you're going to see, whether they're by Rivera or the others, are going to be the result of dealing with the challenge of how do you make a picture that's emotional and real and looks like grounded in realism, and preserving that sense that you're actually painting from life, or at least having some of that magical warmth and light. And you don't necessarily have to have that, but I think it's one thing to consider when you look at Rivera's painting versus Orozco, like where is the emotion and where is a sort of, that's one question versus where is the ethics. Those are two kind of separate questions. What is the political ethical message here versus the execution? Does it preserve a sense of emotion, and where do you emotionally go to when you look at his paintings? So this is a self-portrait by Rivera later in his career. What would you say? Any comments about this self-portrait as far as him? This is later. This is around the time. I think this is actually a painting that was on the cover of Time magazine. So he reached that level of fame where he was on the cover of Time magazine. What do you see with this painting? What does this tell you about the man? He's kind of got this look of like maybe my grandfather's sort of look of kind of like disbelief, or kind of like he's seen it all and kind of looking at you with a little bit of like come on, man. Little Joe Biden, come on, man. But definitely kind of, he's not smiling, kind of looking right at you, piercing you. I could see him being very seductive with his eyes. We'll see that in some of his paintings early on. Very casually dressed. It looks more like he's quoting some of his earlier paintings in the background, The Girl with the Lilies. And maybe this was made actually for Time magazine, but I think when I see it, I definitely feel him kind of being very good at capturing that sense of warmth and light and being clearly, very capable painter. Anything I'm kind of overlooking here as far as you guys? No references to Frida Kahlo here. This is after she died. And she frequently visits his paintings as subject matter. So it could be she's in another part that he's overlooked her. But I think this is, definitely shows his talent. And I think he's not flattering himself. It's a very unflinching look at him getting older. He's not kind of putting on any Instagram filters. Any other comments about this? Okay, good. So here's a painting not by Rivera. Who do you think painted this one? Who's the painter who painted this one? There you go, Frida Kahlo. This is a painting of Diego Rivera by Frida Kahlo, probably, of course, much younger. Interesting to see her kind of how she paints versus his. And of course, she's going to be not tackling the idea of a mural, but of course, she's going to be tackling the subject of living with Diego Rivera. And that's definitely going to be a major part of both of their lives, sort of this relationship. So sort of how that features into his subject matter will be very interesting. But I think definitely Frida Kahlo is romanticizing him a little bit more here than he is himself. The lips are a little red. He's more handsome here. Maybe it's because he's a little younger, but I definitely see a lot of love and attention. Someone the object of affection here. Ears are a little wonky, but I think you'll see with Frida Kahlo, she doesn't have the training maybe early on that Diego Rivera has. But what a wonderful thing to have Diego Rivera as sort of someone overlooking your shoulder, helping you paint better. And I think you'll see that, especially in her evolving self-image from more European to more mestiza. So I think importantly to know about Diego Rivera as far as his autobiography, he's not in Mexico during the revolution. And he does romanticize this sort of pre-Columbian past. In fact, I'd say if there's one kind of guiding motive of his artwork, it's to resurrect Aztec culture and Maya culture as a way to, with his artwork, with painting, as a way to include them into Mexican history. And of course, this idea of creating a Mexican identity is one of the key kind of motives of these Mexican muralists who are initially hired to paint Mexican history, paint the revolution, paint the values of the revolution, especially for the largely illiterate masses of Mexicans who otherwise couldn't read about the Mexican Revolution, but they can see it on the wall of these institutions in Mexico City, which really draws an immediate connection to me with a lot of the European paintings during the Renaissance and earlier, where the goal is to visualize the Bible to people who otherwise couldn't read the Bible. And so it's a great way to reach people who can't read the story and to tell the story visually. Yes, Maggie, you have your hand up.
Yes, I'm just wondering what's going on in the background of this painting
This
because
one here,
I can't seem to figure it out.
this one here, this
Yeah.
painting you see. So I see a reference to one of his famous paintings, a woman with girl with the lilies, and that's what you see on the left here. It looks like he's quoting one of his own paintings, which is just the girl kind of tending to a bouquet of lilies. And other parts, I think, are also references. The man leaning over with a basket full of flowers. That's another visual quote of his own paintings. And I think a few others you'll see. The one in the back kind of is a quote, the court of labor that we're going to see maybe a little bit of today. And the trees in the background, I'd say, is a quote to the stroll on a Sunday in Alameda, the Parque Alameda, which we'll see at the very end. It's an example of one of his later murals that shows trees in the background. So I think he's just kind of putting together a sort of the most famous kind of paintings that most recognizable, and he's putting those in the background as a sort of autobiographical, to increase the autobiographical qualities of the self-portrait. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, you'll recognize these paintings. We'll see them as we move forward. So yeah, that's a great question. You notice he actually blurs the background. Most artists don't, and not until the invention of photography do artists sort of start thinking about blur versus focus versus out of focus. And he seems to sort of be applying some of the rules of photography here to blurring, kind of fuzzy, making the background more fuzzy while the foreground is more crisp. And you don't see that until the invention of photography, where artists are more kind of acutely aware of such things. So that's an interesting observation for me, at least. His ears are a little, a little better here. So ears are always funny, tricky thing to paint. Um, but yeah, that's all that I'll say about that. So moving forward, you see he's part has some Native American ancestry, but probably definitely kind of Criollo and sort of maybe wrestling with some of the Indian identity, Native American identity. But I think that's a key part of his attraction to Frida Kahlo is sort of the celebration of mestizaje, the sort of the idea of being a mix, and Mexico itself being a mix of cultures, and of course his fascination and almost fixation on Aztec culture. And remember, he's sort of discovering Aztec culture at the same time geologists, or not geologists, but anthropologists, archaeologists are literally digging up these remains of Aztec culture that's been buried for centuries and forgotten by Criollo Spanish culture. In the 20th century, the archaeologists are literally digging things up, and so he's discovering these things, hitting the headlines of newspapers, this discovery, that discovery. At the same time, he's sort of painting it onto his canvases. So it's a very exciting time for him to sort of be using his paintbrush to sort of take that which is being kind of dug up out of the ground and to elevate it even further, either by putting it into museums or timelessly immortalized in his canvases. So that's a really neat part of Rivera's contribution to this whole effort to celebrate Mexican identity, including the Aztecs, and literally resurrecting the Aztecs visually with his paintbrush. And that's something Orozco definitely doesn't do in the same kind of way. So here's just some pictures of Posada, the famous caricature artist who painted the skeletons, and you'll see a lot of that influence Diego's work. And you think about there's a real timeless or almost universal appeal to the skeleton as a sort of object, a subject, because it sort of evens out the differences between people, right? We all have a skeleton underneath, and so removing the outer skin, even though you're sort of adding some of the attributes of class or culture, the idea of removing it all and going back to the skeleton, I think, is something that kind of explains the appeal. There's something about it being almost like what you have in carnivals, where you're breaking down the social code, and the skeleton itself is sort of visually kind of finding the lowest, or a common denominator, not the lowest, but a common denominator connecting all people. And then to go on top of that and add this sort of pageantry or the clothing of class or culture is kind of, I think, satire and funny. Let me ask you a question. Could you ever see, or have you ever seen a comic strip in the United States with skeletons, except for Halloween? Could you see a skeletal comic strip, or even like a skeletal maybe cartoon becoming popular in the United States? Or is there?
You ever heard of the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy?
I'm definitely gonna look that up because I'm really curious to see it. Grim Adventures. I love the title already. What's it, Mandy? Who was the first name?
Billy and Mandy.
Is it similar, kind of what we're looking at, like skeletons? At when? What can you tell us when it was from? What time period?
It's from, I mean, I guess the 2000s.
Oh, interesting. So kind of recent. Yeah, I'll check it out. Yeah, I asked this because I wonder if I think it has a lot to do with Catholic culture and even maybe the Aztec Maya influence in Mexico. They sort of focus a more kind of comfort with addressing mortality, the Day of the Dead, visiting people at cemeteries. I'll bet more people in Catholicism bury the dead versus cremation. So maybe some of those, and this is a very fascinating part of culture that I think is overlooked about American culture. Sort of, I personally, and I could be wrong here, but I think there's something about American culture which is so opposite to the idea of showing a skeleton as sort of a subject, as a kind of cartoon thing. Maybe because the puritanical Protestant parts of our culture will not let parents kind of allow their kids to celebrate skeletons. Maybe it veers into superstition or kind of taboo, but it's something that I just remember thinking when I was looking at these, like, I can't think of a good American equivalent to like Skeletor and He-Man, but the idea of having a skeletal figure as a sort of way to break down class differences or just sort of satirize culture. I wonder if that could happen, or why I haven't seen that or maybe I just don't know. Yeah, memento mori. Yeah, the sort of that's kind of like still life, or I can't remember. That's not the same as vida muerte. It's kind of like still life. Is that kind of the translation of memento mori? Because I know there's two different things I'm confusing here. There's still life, which is sort of a weird. It's called vida muerte, and then memento mori is like, is it a object of remembrance, or is it kind of a symbol of the presence of death everywhere? I feel like it's more symbolism about death and the mortality of people. And I feel like we're kind of less comfortable, perhaps, having death as part of the living in the United States, or something about that. Yes, Maggie.
Memento mori, it just means remember one day you will die.
Yeah, right. So it's sort of
Like
a
sort of,
reflection on mortality, right?
yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I feel like that's the same. That's similar to this. I feel like there's something about the United States where we're so focused on living and not, and I'm like, and that's, I think, very similar to our focus on materialism. Like in a way, we put people in retirement home. We don't live with our grandparents. We don't have the sort of extended family that lives together. And that's probably a bad thing. We don't have the Day of the Dead. We have Halloween, right? That's the one day of the year where skeletons and things kind of, and I'm sure there's exceptions to this, maybe in parts of the United States which are more historically Catholic, Arcadian, maybe along the Mississippi River, Louisiana. But certainly, I wonder, do we have the quote? Can you think, Damien Hirst did the skeleton covered with diamonds? And I'd say that's the closest I could think of, sort of an artist addressing the idea of mortality, but without any, but in his case, it's a lot of irony in a way, sort of talking about materialism and death and, wealth and extravagance. So I wonder if sort of, if you find anything similar to this, it might be in the folk art, or maybe naive art or outsider art in America. But I definitely think it's a fascinating thing to think about, that sort of ongoing legacy of Catholicism and Aztec culture in Mexico, and this sort of skeleton figure, Caterina, or just Posada's work in general, giving a beard and wings. I mean, I'd love to see this turn into a sculpture, a bearded, winged skeleton on a bike. And it reminds me actually of paintings from the plague. Here you could see in Europe kind of the triumph of death over class and culture. I definitely could see a connection back to Europe here, going back to Catholicism and the importance of a skeleton, and even maybe the idea of the plague and death pits and skeletons being everywhere, dancing skeletons from this time period in Europe after the plague, almost like a sardonic, sadistic sort of celebration of death, triumphing over the living. And here's some fun non-anatomical rib cages, kind of like Orozco. Really creepy and weird to see skeletons dancing. Definitely fitting for the Halloween season. So here we have some paintings by Rivera when he's in Europe, and this is before the revolution. So he was already going to Europe. I think a lot of families, and I get the impression that he's probably from a family that's not maybe super wealthy, but wealthy enough to have enough connections, where I think it was actually someone in Veracruz who funded his trip to Rivera, and they probably identified his talents early on. And I think you can see he's, exquisitely gifted painter, and this sense of light and, the warmth of colors. And, he's definitely, when you compare something like Hitler, Hitler's paintings are very naturalistic, but almost like he's so gets into details that are like Rivera, thank God, ignores, and for the sake of kind of the painting having a sort of life of its own without needing to be just like a photograph. And so these are some early paintings by Rivera before the revolution in Europe. And you can really see how he's just sort of got the natural sense of light and warmth and reacting to color without being too slavish to accuracy. It's just this perfect kind of middle ground between kind of accuracy and kind of emotionalizing and responding to that, that reflection and that whole that he creates, that abstract whole, is just wonderful. And you can see from an early age he's painting, and here are those seductive eyes that I pointed out. This is a painting by a young man, I think very much kind of like, being cool. is the equivalent of maybe Robert Mapplethorpe tackling masculinity in his photography, the guy with a leather self-portrait, a leather jacket and a cigarette. Well, what makes you cool as a young man? You lower your voice. Maybe got a beer and a hat. The hat is so awesome. You can just imagine him hanging out in Spain and France, his pipe and his hat, and he's a very large in the life figure, as a lot of people say, and does this picture capture that? Not necessarily for me. I feel like he's more kind of, when I look at this, I feel like I'm looking at a combination of Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn in the bar, in that scene in the book of Lord of the Rings. He's sort of just got a lot of that sort of youthful swagger with the pipe. And this is a self-portrait from in Europe. And he goes back to Mexico after the revolution. Of course, remember the revolution is in Mexico while he's in Spain. And that definitely probably got to play into a sense of missing out itis, or maybe even he might feel a sense of needing to compensate for the fact that he wasn't in Mexico during the revolution. So that's something for you to maybe think about. I think it was a good move for him to leave, because there's no reason to, necessarily, you don't have to fight the revolution. You can also win the peace, and they're both valid. So, if he ever felt any sort of maybe inadequacy, I hope he didn't, but that's something to consider. Maybe when someone like Siqueiros, who actually fought in the revolution, is hanging out with Rivera, there might be a little bit of competition anxiety there. Here is Zapata and Pancho Villa at this peak moment of the revolution, 1914. And so this is all going on while Rivera is probably reading about it in the newspaper in Spain. And that might have other artists asking him, hey, why aren't you fighting the revolution? So who knows, maybe that is something that helps plant the seeds of him needing to be a very visible, virtuous member of the Communist Party. Maybe some of that is him making up for the fact that people gave him grief for not fighting the Mexican Revolution. Personally, I think it's great that he didn't fight. You're not obligated to fight in the revolution, especially because you need people to sort of paint the murals after the revolution. So, I'd totally give him a pass. For maybe even his parents, I kind of wanted to cart him off to Europe to avoid, possibly dying, or all the atrocities that took place during this. And by the way, something like 400,000 Mexicans died during the Mexican Revolution as a whole, if not more. You can compare that to 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War. So incredibly bloody. And, probably every person in Mexico probably knew someone who saw atrocities or were a victim of many atrocities. But so while that's taking place, Diego Rivera is kind of in Europe working through Cubism and modernism. And this painting will go back to again and again, because it's really important, going back to the idea of Picasso. And I'm sorry about the noise in the background, I'll talk louder. So you got Picasso really abstracting the figure and working with the figure still, but pushing it into abstraction. And this is so important for understanding abstract expressionism, because someone like Jackson Pollock really wants to get past Picasso. Picasso is this sort of like the Beethoven of the 1800s for composers. Like, how do I make music that doesn't sound like Beethoven? Or like today, it might be, how do I make music that doesn't sound like Lady Gaga? And it's sort of because you're hearing it everywhere and there's such a major figure. Today it might be like, how do I make art that doesn't look like Banksy, or doesn't look like abstract expressionism? So back in this time, Jackson Pollock wants to push art forward past abstraction into something new, but the figure is still there. The human figure as a source of emotional kind of connection, emotional sort of, or subject matter, is still kind of there as a sort of wall, through which Jackson Pollock has to pass, like phase through, or he has to blow it up or climb over. So this is sort of like, this painting is kind of hanging over artists like Jackson Pollock as like the specter of European modernism and Picasso. And how do you get past Picasso? And how does America develop its own unique kind of style of art? And this includes sort of, how do Mexicans develop their own unique style of art that's distinctly Mexican? And we don't necessarily see Cubism in Mexican muralism, but there could be little hints of it, because definitely Diego Rivera spent a lot of time working through Cubism. Now, let me ask you a question. Why might Cubism not be the best technique for a mural if you're hired by the Mexican government to paint the Mexican Revolution for people who are illiterate to come see and say, oh, that's what happened, I could see it? why might Cubism not be the most fitting form of art for Mexican for muralism, or am I or could it be? What might be one limit for Cubism, or why didn't it become the sort of technique of people like Orozco and Siqueiros and Rivera when they paint their murals?
Maybe because it isn't like exactly realistic, so people will have a hard time understanding what's going on and interpreting the piece.
Yeah, anyone else want to chime in on that? I think that's pretty spot on. There might be maybe another level of sort of academia. Like, remember, the art world sort of has its own sort of echo chamber, and other artists might understand this completely. But maybe if you're not in the art world, it might be a distraction, and maybe you'll get people who say like, why can't you just paint it, real? Why does it need to have all this sort of, this sort of kind of theory, the theory sort of informing the painting, right? So keep that in mind. That goes to the heart of the question of like the art world being relevant to the world at large. And I think you would probably agree the art world today is even more kind of, it's very rare that you see the average person go to a museum or art gallery, and when they do, they might confront artwork where they, unless you go to art school, it's hard to maybe put it into context or understand it. Which is hopefully where a good art historian might come in and help, or a bad art historian would just make it worse. But I think you nailed it, Sarah, with the idea that the average person, they don't necessarily understand all the sort of theorizing that goes into Cubism as sort of a way to innovate and experiment on what came before, because especially because a mural is now something that's public. It's now, especially if it's commissioned by the government, now it's also sort of the subject matter must sort of kind of fit into the society at large in a way. So you can see how just by making a picture public and big, now you're moving away from, or you're sort of forced to kind of leave behind the sort of concerns of academia, or maybe the concerns of the art world, in favor of maybe the clarity or realism that people will connect to. And you could say that's a critique of the society at large not able to enjoy experimentation for experimentation's sake. But I think it has more to do with just the idea that a mural needs to be clear or expressive. And I think Cubism, for all of its sort of innovation, doesn't necessarily enhance the emotion of the picture with its Cubism. And that's debatable, of course. But I think for me personally, I think Cubism adds a sort of kind of compositional wizardry. It makes you think about how things look from different points of view. It flattens things out and eliminates depth because it's sort of starting to embrace abstraction. But it does so almost at the expense of emotion, or it doesn't necessarily seem to add a lot more emotion to the scene. And again, I know that's totally debatable, but I just think that's something also to consider when it comes to why Cubism isn't the sort of style of muralism. A lot of it is what Sarah said. I think a little bit is also sort of, you want to still connect to people, including emotionally, as well as the sort of clarity. And so, here's some examples of Cubism by Diego Rivera. On the one on the right, I think you can see he's adding more of the sort of Mexican flavor with the poncho. There's very distinctly Mexican colors, Mexican textures there. So it's fun to see, the two blended together. Some landscapes from Toledo. I guess everyone has to do a landscape of Toledo. I think I have a drawing of Toledo somewhere. And these are a lot of fun. This is almost like a Mexican mural by Diego Rivera that's been sort of balled up into a wad of paper. And here it is. It's like an abstract mural. And I think you could see some of the elements like a gun, the poncho. And yet, if you put this on the wall of the Mexican Ministry of Education and said, here is Diego Rivera's art, I think the average Mexican is going to really have a hard time understanding why you put all that money into funding the artist. And you could see the same thing happen in the United States in the 1990s, maybe when Giuliani was criticizing the Brooklyn Museum for mounting an exhibit of sensationalist art by the likes of Mapplethorpe and Ophelia in Africa. He did something where he took the Virgin Mary and added elephant dung, and it makes sense to the art world, but to the public at large, it's hard to maybe, it gets lost in translation. So I think you could see this as a great example of something Rivera isn't going to do, because it requires too much understanding of maybe abstraction. It's not clear how this maybe relates to the Mexican Revolution in a narrative sense. So in a way, Rivera will take painting back to the European tradition of narrative painting, which is not modernism. Modernism is abstraction, it's non-narrative, it's expression. And for the sake of clarity and sort of serving the revolution, I think Rivera will really push things back to narrative painting from Europe. And that kind of still leaves Orozco to be the guy who's pushing that expressionism and pushing that kind of more kind of non-narrative approach. So here are some moments of abstraction from Diego Rivera, but definitely in his murals you won't see this sort of abstraction or the cubism here. And by the way, these are several paintings he did. It looks like he's documenting the woman who then gets pregnant. I think in the second one it looks like she's pregnant, and then the third one there's a newborn, and sadly the son, I think it's son from what I read, so this must have been maybe a girlfriend or partner of Diego Rivera's who dies. I don't know how he dies, but that definitely has got to be devastating for all of them involved. And maybe, and I don't know too much about how this plays out, but I do know that he ends up marrying Frida Kahlo 10 years later in 1926. So, could be, and this is why it's important when you look at paintings like the Virgin Mary, if you ever go to the museum and you see the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus, up until about 50 years ago, 70 years ago, most people lost at least one child in childbirth, infant mortality and death during delivery. And so modern medicine, it's, even though Orozco is criticizing the woman giving birth, modern medicine has definitely removed a lot of the specter of the dread and despair of losing a child, especially, losing a child after you've given birth to them versus a miscarriage. It's got to be just a horror. And after you painted the woman, pregnant, it's almost even more painful to see the picture of the child born and know that it doesn't survive. So this definitely must have a big emotional impact on Diego Rivera. Personally, whether or not cubism is the best way of emotionalizing or making me connect to these subjects here, I think for me, again, that's like those boxes behind her feel really just sort of, kind of arbitrary. There are wonderful examples of cubism, and I think I like this a lot more than Picasso's cubism because this at least has a lot of bright colors. I can't stand the sort of murky colors of Braque or Picasso, and cubism generally is so small. If you make cubism really big, I would love it. And that's what I think American modern, like abstract expressionist artists discover, that you've got to go big if you want to be modern, not easel. So here's Siqueiros. And I think Diego Rivera and Siqueiros started hanging out with each other after Diego Rivera and his wife lost their child. That I think makes sense to me as far as, in life, having a new person as a sort of someone to help you navigate through the healing and the trauma. I think Siqueiros, came to, or either was in Paris at the same time, but they both take a trip down to Italy. Here they are together in Paris. Of course, they have to have the backdrop of Paris instead of real Paris, but they take a trip down to Italy from Paris to go visit these paintings in Italy at the time, and probably till today you can see the same paintings because these are from several hundred years later. And here we get to, I think, a really interesting part of Diego Rivera. It's really important to understand the influence of European painting. And if you ever look at Renaissance painting, it's very interesting. We're talking again about making pictures that visualize scenes from the Bible to the illiterate. So anyone seeing this can understand the lamentation over Jesus after he's taken down from the cross without being able to, while not being able to read the Bible, you could see the picture and understand it. So that's the real point of these paintings, is to deepen people's faith in Christianity, and more important, their faith in the authority of the church, especially after the Black Plague or the bubonic plague in the 1300s had sort of shattered people's faith in the church, because people could no longer trust that the church was your guaranteed way to get to heaven, because even if you went to church, a lot of your family members died or you died. So a lot of people started doubting that the church had this absolute authority, but people still had absolute authority in God, or sense of authority in God, because of course people understood mortality better than ever. So a lot of this Renaissance work comes in the wake of this kind of collective trauma, which is the plague, and as a way to sort of initiate this public relations campaign to get people to stay going to the church, to keep recognizing the authority of the church. And yeah, these paintings are very powerful. So let me ask you a question. Where do you see emotion in this painting? And this is something, Diego Rivera is looking at this with Siqueiros, probably thinking, hey, this is really, there's something wonderful going on here. Where's the emotion in this painting?
I think it lies a lot onto the faces of the characters.
Yeah, and also the body language too, right? Especially the angels, right? They're almost doing these yoga postures up above, and it's like heaven is recoiling emotionally from this moment, and earth down below is likewise recoiling from this very powerful moment where Jesus is, I think that's passing away. So you see this mirroring of emotion above, angels all sort of doing these different body things of emotion, because the faces are emotional. They all have kind of this look of shock, at least depending on the face, but especially the body language is really transmitting emotion. Do you follow what I'm saying there? Even the guys on the right, they're sort of the body language, the hands sort of calmly kind of like linked together, just kind of shows like interest, but they're far enough away where they're sort of commenting on it, kind of like those two figures in the Bonampak murals, the Maya figures in waiting in line. They're sort of just, it humanizes, but it's sort of a one part of the emotional range you see, including other emotions like shock, comfort, compassion, but a lot of subtlety. One person's kind of got her fist prayer, clasp in prayer, and it's very specific emotions. One's got her hands up, and the faces are emotional, but especially the bodies that I think are especially emotional. And I think that's really important to think about. Let's see what we have some chats here. Yeah, very exaggerated, almost Italian body, exaggerated body language. And so think about that. The red robe, green, yeah, upper, middle was catch my attention the most. The human, the red robe. Yeah, the red robe, especially the guy with his arms out doing the Naruto run. I think that's when from anime, the Naruto run, right? So that sense of shock with his arms out, that really gives you a specific emotion of his arms out. He's rushing in, like discovering that what everyone's kind of what they're kind of what they're the thing of that they're interested in, which is Jesus, of course. And this is very interesting as far as Diego Rivera, because what I find is going to be missing from a lot of Diego Rivera's, not all. I think what he's seeing is here's these big murals, these frescoes that are made in Europe that are kind of visualizing stories to the illiterate, and he'll crowd in a lot of people to sort of show the sense of groups or populations. But I think it's one thing that I noticed with Rivera's paintings, and there are exceptions like here, and I think there's probably an obvious connection between these two paintings, is his understanding that like the emotionalism of the body. I feel like Orozco's paintings really understand that a lot better than Rivera. And there's a big exception. I'm showing you one of the big exceptions here. But even here, I feel like there's one thing you're going to see a lot in Rivera's paintings is this flirtatious horse. And that's what I call it, because I see this a lot. You see the horse in the background, he's kind of looking at you, kind of these almost like flirtatious eyes, both of them. You're going to see that in many of his paintings. And it's not necessarily the center of the painting. Like I'd say in this one, the horse is one, it's not something you see immediately. But when you notice that he's definitely adding some emotion, almost humanizing that horse, both of them, kind of like these two lovers, or it's almost a different emotion than the rest of the painting. But even going to the foreground with the painting in the foreground, well, you tell me, what emotions do you feel here in the foreground with the painting? What's going on here? You notice you don't see the faces like you do as much in the painting on the left. So I think the body language has to do it if you can't do it through the faces. But interestingly, for me, the body language is, it's interesting he decided not to have him kind of looking up a little more so we could see. But I see comfort and sort of, someone kind of giving attention and showing compassion. But for me personally, it's interesting because a lot of people compare these two paintings. I see a lot more emotion in the left than on the right. I definitely feel sympathy for the person who's been flogged, but it's very interesting for me to think, the body feels very lifeless and kind of drained and very definitely, worth earning a lot of my sympathy. But there's something interesting about Rivera where I wonder about why I don't necessarily feel as much emotional connection as I do with Orozco. And so this is sort of something to keep thinking about as we look at his work. So remember, the scale aspect of muralism is very important. I think Michelangelo understood this with the Sistine Chapel. You notice there's some parts that stand out better than others, famously the creation of Adam there in the middle. But really, this idea of emotionalizing the body, I think you really see that with Michelangelo, treating the not the phases so much as the physical activities of the body, because at this scale and at this distance, you really kind of need to communicate emotion somehow, and it might be through movement and the physical body more so than maybe facial expressions. Like here, for instance, this feels like it has a lot of color and balance, but the movement of Jesus is the only place where I really feel any kind of real kind of humanity. And even hell down below has the most sort of emotion. It almost looks like a Orozco painting, that brushy fire going into hell, which is almost like Jesus, like an unfertilized human egg going out into hell. A lot of kind of Catholic undertones there. But that emotion you see in the body is something Leonardo da Vinci also discovers. And so it's interesting for me that Rivera is in Italy looking at all these paintings that we're looking at. And he's sort of inspired to make murals translating maybe some of the use of scale and figures grouped together, but he doesn't have as much interest in the emotionalism of the body. And you might disagree, and I might, in fact, be totally wrong, and it'd be wonderful if I am. But that's something I've noticed as I look at Rivera. Sort of, I'm missing some of this sort of interest in the physical body as a source of emotion. And I think that's something for you to consider as we look at Rivera's paintings, because a lot of the reason why they did these anatomical drawings, Da Vinci and Michelangelo, because they understood that to emotionalize the body means to really understand the body from outside in or inside out, the skeletons, the musculature, the tendons, because that really gives you an emotional connection to the body. I think you especially see that here. And this could, almost be a Rivera painting, but with this big exception for me, which is sort of is a lot more kind of emotion going on. And so it's a question for me when you look at Rivera's work evolve. I think what evolves is really him understanding more kind of this idea of emotional connection rather than just flooding you, overwhelming you with kind of ambition and a lot of details and a lot of subject matter. So I think we have a little more time. I want to keep going for a few more minutes. You can see that in some of these paintings from Europe. Oh my goodness, a squirrel, I guess, crawled out of the bathroom and decided to run around, and here he is. So Raphael right here, look at all the emotion, the emotion of seeing Jesus risen. This is really, Raphael clearly understands like emotion is really going to get people really passionate and interested in subject matter. And I think you see that here too, even in this example from, Aztec, or I guess this would be Olmec, or art from Teotihuacan, the physical body as a source of emotion. You notice they're even emitting those sort of that sacred kind of air from their bodies. And this is almost like a last judgment, very similar to Michelangelo, kind of this figure judging people on their way to the afterlife. So the emotional body. And I very much think Rivera is kind of merging this kind of stuff, the colors, the sort of power, the scale, with European painting. So, he meets Frida Kahlo as he's painting some of the early murals in honor of sort of that he was commissioned to make to create this sort of Mexican identity in some of these public institutions. And this is a very important part of his life, and of course of her life. And in a moment, we'll sort of see, or maybe we'll see next class, how that initiates. But it is one of his early paintings he painted when he returns back to Mexico in around the 1920s. Definitely a lot of European influence. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But you might notice even here, I see an exquisite painting, but I don't necessarily have any emotional connection to honestly anyone in this painting. The one I have an emotional connection to is the person wearing a mask on the right. And I'm not saying it's not beautiful and it's not better than anything I could ever paint. And it's not just wonderful on its own. But I think for me, this interesting question of emotion at large scale is really interesting to me, because on something like this, I don't feel that much emotion from the physical bodies or from the faces or from what they're doing. And so that's something to keep in mind. And the first steps on this, pathway to sort of visualizing Mexican identity is this guy, Dr. Adel, who we saw from the Orozco lecture, sort of understanding that Mexico needs its own Mexican identity, and the artwork of Mexico should reflect this sort of unique Mexican identity. And he's the one who hires Orozco and Siqueiros to work for the Vanguardia, very similar to sort of Posada's, or very much like in Posada's legacy of sort of using print to to extol the virtues of the revolution. And it is a very fitting title, calling it a Renaissance, because it's very much like the European Renaissance, and it's using a lot of the same rules, which is rediscovering identity in the wake of a trauma. European Renaissance would be maybe the Black Death or the bubonic plague, but also using artwork to tell stories to the illiterate and deepen their faith. In this case, deepen their faith in the sense of national identity, deepen their belief in an overarching, transcendent Mexican identity that overcomes differences. So that tribalism of the fractured, multifaceted Mexican population transcended by art that visualizes them all into one cohesive Mexicanness. Similar to maybe in the United States, you might think of how sports or pop culture transcends our differences. So maybe, or if you go to the beach, you might, beach is a place where you meet people you might, or see people you might not see otherwise, and it transcends any self-segregation or historical segregation that goes on. So that's so important as the Mexican murals. And I'll just very briefly start on this murals, some of the murals that we see in the early 1920s, and on another day we'll pick up on this next class. But I want to remind you again, this transition from easel to mural definitely kind of corresponds to the shift from personal, emotional, and reacting to actual subject matter versus sort of creating pictures that use some of the rules of naturalism and are drawing from life, but might lack some of that sense of light or life. Because especially think about if you're making a mural, you're not necessarily painting a scene. And so you might be sort of collaging different things together. And as a result, there might not be one light source. You might not be reacting to something physically there. So things might lose some of that emotional sort of warmth that you have in an easel painting that has an automatic emotional connection because you can feel the artist reacting to something real, versus maybe a mural that might end up losing some of that but gaining something else at the same time. So here we're going into a very important kind of early mosaic, a mural by Rivera, and you can see it's these two courtyards, the Court of Fiestas and the Court of Labor. And I just want to briefly get ahead to the Court of Fiestas so we could take a look at one of his more famous. By the way, here's another reference to maybe the background in that Rivera portrait that we saw at the beginning that Maggie was asking about, when the guy's holding like a rack or some kind of raft or something. We'll go back to this next class. I want to look at this one here. So, wow, I mean, this is amazing. This is really, it's such a wonderful example. You guys have probably seen this one before. What are we looking at here?
Tenochtitlan.
Yeah, exactly. In the background, we've got we're actually, looking at Mexico City, right? We're looking at Mexico City as it was, because now Mexico City has completely buried everything we see, the lake, the city of Tenochtitlan. So this is Rivera, restoring Tenochtitlan to life using painting. And I think he does a, wonderful job. And I like this mural quite a bit because he does have this landscape connecting everything together. It's not necessarily like a collage of different moments. You notice he's got this sort of the foreground and the sort of middle ground, which is kind of figures slightly foreshortened. And then of course we have Tenochtitlan in the background. Now let me ask you, Milton, where do you feel an emotional connection here, if anything, at all? Where's there any emotional? And I don't mean like happy or whatever, just like any kind of humanity. Where do you focus your emotional interests, if anywhere, at first?
Nowhere in particular.
Good. Okay. And what about you, Danielle? I see your hands up.
I would say the woman on the right, the one dressed in white. I feel like
Yeah.
she's the one who has like the most expression in her face, and she's looking at something in particular.
Yeah, I feel that, if anything, there too. And I also feel a little bit what Milton said. Like I don't necessarily, it's almost kind of like this painting I just passed by. This is from the plague in Europe in the 1400s, I'm sorry, 1300s, but painted, afterwards. When there's no one focal point, you notice that our focus is more on the activity and on the action of everyone. So I think that's similar to what you see in Rivera's painting, where you've got all this activity, but there's no one focal point. And that's the idea, that your focus is on this stuff that's happening, this world, this society. But as a consequence, you might not necessarily have that emotional connection you have maybe when someone's painting from life or focusing on one thing, one object, one subject, one focal point. And so if anything stands out for me, it's definitely the woman making this sort of looking at who was probably the equivalent of Montezuma or Montezuma's father, um, and it almost like occupying the spot where Frida Kahlo is supposed to be, right? You'll eventually see that Frida Kahlo kind of becomes that woman. So this is before Frida Kahlo becomes like, maybe this is close to around when he meets her, and maybe this is him kind of early kind of putting her in. But definitely for me, that's the only place I connect to emotionally. I think a lot of people look at Rivera might not understand this part, which is I love that it's almost like Where's Waldo. I see a lot of things going on. He's really kind of clearly trying to resurrect Aztec culture. But what I'm missing is this emotional connection, and not just because maybe it's not painted from life, but also he's not kind of giving you some kind of moments of either like Orozco moments of abstract kind of color or tone to give you a sense of like some kind of emotional connection, but also between the figures. They're almost like standing around, but not, and they're doing stuff, but even the activities I don't feel struggle yet. And you will see it later in his paintings, but that's something I think that's missing. Like the figures carrying the carpets up above on the left, they're not struggling the way I'll see them struggle in some of his later paintings. And even those faces you described, Milton, so there's sort of a kind of a convention there with kind of painting what would be maybe what they think as a sort of non-European face versus European face. But that's for me such a fascinating question that we'll pick up on more. Like you see that guy giving that kind of weird, leery, creepy look to the woman. That for me is like, oh, I see Rivera investing emotionally in this little moment here. Um, but it also kind of makes me wonder just about Rivera and sort of as something we'll tackle later is sort of the idea of him, his womanizing, his cheating, cheating on Frida with her sister is really like crossing the line. And it, for me, it goes to maybe something really fundamental about your character where you would really, it's like self-sabotage. And I wonder, I really, part of me want to find a connection between this lack of emotion in some of his works and maybe his own kind of, his own, things that we all have to, deal with in our own personal lives. So here you could see that emotional connection. And, I see an arm cut off. Maybe he's offering that arm. That could be a Spaniard's arm. But that's what I'm interested in, that arm. And I want to know more. So I think Rivera is sort of challenge. He's like, what if I flood the picture with everything, and just the ambition and sort of scope of it is what he's thinking is what people will connect to. But I think ultimately I get overwhelmed, and I kind of want to see him kind of put more of an emotional investment into these little moments. And even something like this feels more emotional to me, maybe because it's real. It's like a real place with real people instead of just thousands of people kind of weirdly collected together. But also they're doing activities that their bodies really kind of more kind of one-on-one with their activities, not like a spectacle for with thousands of people. So I wonder if Rivera's solution to the scale of a mural with putting lots of people in it might sort of be both a pro and a con. And so something to consider as his work evolves into the next period we'll see is, whether or not he shifts his style, because he definitely continues doing paintings similar to the one we just saw with lots of people in it. But I think where I feel more of an emotional connection is something like this. By the way, this is a precursor to the one he makes later on in 1931 at the MoMA. And you notice the horses don't have the flirtatious eyes yet. So that's something he changes. And, he does make little changes here and there as well. So any questions? I think this is probably a good place to end for today before we get really too strong and too deep into Diego Rivera. But like you compare this, there you can see the horses, those very flirtatious eyes looking right out at the viewer. That for me is a very specific emotion that kind of breaks the fourth wall, that kind of takes me a little bit out of the painting. And you don't see that here. The horses don't have that same kind of humanity. And I definitely wonder, why, that if I feel any emotional connection, it's almost to the man in the back on the right, who's looking on kind of with sad. But even then, I'm still not super connected. Like Orozco, I could see him doing this in a much more like those marks on the body on an Orozco would be like deep, bloody, dripping cuts. And so I wonder about Diego Rivera, risk taking. Maybe he takes a lot of his risks in his love life, and not as many risks in his paintings, and of course that's debatable and might change as we see his work evolve, but something to consider is that emotional connection to work, especially at a big scale. So on that note, maybe ask any questions you have about anything coming up, but otherwise I'll post some things. Daniela, yes.
Wait, so I'm a little confused about the midterm and the paper. Are they two separate things, or is the midterm?
Yeah, the midterm, the paper I'll assign after you guys turn in the midterm, and but start thinking about a mural you want to write about for your paper. Formal analysis would be out of
Okay.
yeah, and the
Also,
mural, the midterm will be take home on Canvas, and I'll probably post it before next Wednesday, next Thursday. But you'll be able to basically have a week to do it, and you'll just be analyzing a few murals or a few pictures we've seen in the early part of the semester. Does that make sense?
okay. Now
Yeah,
it's clear. Thank you.
you're welcome.
How much time will we be having? I know for the midterm, obviously a week, but how much time are we getting?
Unlimited. I'll figure out what tweak it. So
Oh,
it's just something you upload based on. You'll probably just look at the pictures and you have unlimited time to upload something.
Right.
Yeah,
Could you
make sure.
also reiterate on the poster assignment? Because I distinctly remember you.
Oh yeah, I need to
talking
post
about,
that too.
like-
A place for you to upload the
Okay,
Canvas.
okay.
Yeah, of course. Yep, absolutely. And also, I think just remember if you need this, listen to any recordings, I can share them with you. Just I need you to email me to request them and give me a few more hours to post a few more of them up. I only have one or two posted right now. Daniela, yes.
It is another really dumb question, but for the assignment.
So we're starting off kind of where we left off with Diego Rivera. This painting here, The Liberation of the Peon, seems to address some of the events of the Mexican Revolution. And I was pointing out this interesting idea of emotion in paintings, and we'll kind of pick up on that theme again, but just to get you guys your brains moving. What do you think is what's the message of this painting? What's the sort of visual message here? Is it just about documenting the revolution?
It kind of feels like the apathy of war and like the discontent he feels towards it, I suppose.
Yeah, there's it's like a war journalism in a way. That's a good point, like war and sort of what happens during war. So kind of documenting the revolution, but more, yeah, the treatment of lower classes. Yeah, it looks like they're kind of coming to the aid of this person who's been lashed. And, we've got the back of the persons and the lashings facing us. And it looks like there's a city, the town is burning in the background. So, I think would be an example of him using his muralism to document the Mexican Revolution. Remember, Diego Rivera was in Europe during most of the revolution. So he didn't necessarily witness this kind of stuff firsthand. And, Daniela, yes, what were we going to say?
Oh, that also everyone looks really emotionless. So even though it's a sad image,
Yeah,
it feels like he doesn't want
for
to
you
convey
is
that feeling of sad.
what for you is emotional here? Which part of it, and which
It's
emotion?
not emotional.
Oh, not
It doesn't
emotional.
have emotion. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel sort of torn about. I feel like he's trying to make this emotional. I definitely feel like some sense of kind of this figure's being released from being bound to like a post in the middle of maybe outside of town, and I really kind of my first impulse is, oh yeah, there's something that draws me into it, and yet there's something about it that I think for me again it goes back to Orozco having, if you're involved in theater or in dance, you understand maybe the body, but also arranging figures on a stage, and you can think of a canvas as sort of arranging things for the viewer. So on one hand, I notice with a lot of Rivera's paintings is often he doesn't have a figure engaging the viewer. And that I'm not saying you have to have that, but that's one of the things I notice about his work that might kind of remove you from the emotional connection. But I also find that he doesn't also have faces looking up enough the way any director would in a stage production, just to make sure there's that constant emotional connection. And now you could do that and make it feel very contrived and it wouldn't work. So, that's just something to notice as we move forward today with Rivera's work, is how his work evolves. Because in some ways he hits the ground running. He's clearly really skilled and has a very clear vision of what he wants out of his artwork. And I think it'll be interesting for you guys to see how he sort of, one, how his work evolves, but two, also how there's sort of emotion kind of plays out in his work, either in terms of the physical body being emotional, right? Because I think you feel some sense of this body is lifeless and almost like beaten to death, like a piece of meat. I definitely feel that sensation because it almost looks like the other person's removing muscle tissue. But even that said, I don't feel much of emotional connection to the other viewers or the other subjects, except maybe the guy looking on holding the horses. But honestly, the most real of human emotion I feel is from those two horses who are kind of looking out at the audience. I guess the horses are looking at us, but the humans aren't. But their emotions are just sort of distinct from everything else going on. And I think the fire burning for me feels more sort of engaging emotionally necessarily than what's going on in the foreground. And that might just be the quality of the image here on screen. But I think if you're thinking about theater, you often want the faces to be seen because that sets up that emotional connection. And again, I don't think that's a must, but I think I'm trying to figure out what it is exactly about Rivera that doesn't quite have that same emotional charge. One of them is the brushwork, how loose and brushy the sort of the execution of the painting is, but also I think maybe how many figures you have, how many people there are. Also, I think whether or not the figures are in a setting that's sort of realistic versus maybe thousands of people jumbled together. And in this case, I do think he's set up a realistic sort of scenario in which this sort of scene plays out. But I think for me, when I compare it to other paintings by Rivera, one thing that's different about this one and the other ones is maybe the faces, people looking out at the viewer, engaging the viewer, involving the viewer in the moment, but also the body not being as emotional. And I think that partly comes from his figures having that sort of Botero like kind of modernist shape where Rivera spent a lot of his formative years in Europe, and I think he's definitely sort of imprinted modernism imprinted deeply into his artistic sort of soul. And I think that is sort of why his figures are kind of like almost semi-abstracted, maybe not as naturalistic in the sense of the observing musculature. I think he's trying to find a happy balance between modernism and all that abstraction therein, and being clear and for the average illiterate Mexican who can process these images without being distracted by any cubism or whatnot. So I think he kind of left behind the cubism, but he's still very much in this sort of, I think, wrestling or using modernism, not so much as far as everything being super abstracted, but semi-abstracted, and the figures, the shapes, the bodies are all sort of somewhat, I don't know if I wouldn't call them abstract, but I think he's definitely kind of making them more into a sort of kind of hybrid of like not cartoon shapes, but maybe something. I think it's because instead of actually looking at a subject and painting it, which is almost impossible to do if you're doing a mural, I think it's because you're sort of transferring the idea of how things look in reality onto a wall without necessarily observing it. He's probably copying a sketch or transferring a sketch onto the wall, and so maybe it loses some of that vitality you get from actually observing a subject and painting it. But I don't know if that's what's going on. But these are just some things in my head that I'm considering as to why there's something about, again, Jackson Pollock took a pilgrimage to go visit Orozco and not Rivera. And I think there's something about Rivera that doesn't quite have that spark of uniquely American modernism as a new world modernism or new world maybe expressionism, because and it might be because Diego Rivera is still kind of in this European modernism, which tends to flatten. Because one thing I do notice is Diego Rivera tends to flatten out a lot of the canvases or the murals that are really big, whereas the smaller ones, he kind of lets things inhabit a real space. So that's another thing to think about, is sort of how he uses depth, because one of the big no-nos in modernism is to use the illusion of depth. So a lot of modernist paintings, whether it's cubism or abstraction, tends to flatten out the painting because it sort of rejects the idea of the illusion of depth, because in a way that's sort of what photography can do better, and painting is liberated in the early 20th century from the constraints of being accurate. So in a way, he's sort of I think, tries not to be so have a lot of depth because he spent so much time training in Europe and with these other modernists to whom abstraction and modernism was more important than accuracy and the illusionism of painting. Of course, when Diego Rivera returns to Mexico, I think he gets rid of the cubism and some of the modernism because he has a higher calling to be clear and concise to the illiterate Mexicans who wouldn't really know the Mexican Revolution unless he painted it. So keep in mind, these are sort of pedagogical paintings intended to impart this history of Mexico to the average Mexican. And that's really cool. I think if you look at his work from that point of view, absolutely, it really makes sense. It sings, it soars. So you can compare this painting, often art historians compare it to the painting on the left. And here on the left, I think you could see this is probably how a stage director would have, it almost looks like a stage play because of the way all the faces are really clear. And we see the body language kind of connects to the facial expressions, and you have a range of emotions there on the left. And I wonder, if Diego Rivera was maybe more drawn to maybe he was just studying the fresco technique and looking at the composition and putting together a lot of figures. But for some reason, I don't think the emotional quality of these frescoes is what is something that he took necessarily from his visit to Italy with Siqueiros from Paris when he was in Europe. It looks more like maybe later on he eventually discovers a sort of emotional layer. But I think it's partly, again, because modernism and emotion, just like modernism and depth, don't seem to sort of coexist in the same realm. But that's up for us to be seen, or up to be seen by us today. So I think it works a lot better, his style here, when you have really smaller spaces, fewer figures. This is so much more emotional for me than the last painting. Even though I don't even see the faces necessarily, their body language for me really gives me a sense of despair. Well, what do you think? It feels kind of like these figures are like descending into hell. Am I getting the right emotional reading from this? Entrance to the mine.
It does have a gloomy feeling to it.
Say that again.
It does have a really gloomy, scary feeling to it. Like they're sad. They don't want to go there, but they're going anyways.
Right, it's really sad. Yeah, going down, descending, and yeah, the brushstroke, the brushiness here for me contributes to that feeling of despair. And I'm not exactly sure why, but I think you could see maybe because we're closer up. But I really think Diego Rivera's art, when you look at his paintings, like the one-on-one portraits or any self-portrait, any painting of smaller groups of people, there's a different emotional tone. It almost looks a little more like Orozco than his more ambitious paintings. And here's another example of, this is a painting commissioned or in the same vein as the other ones with visualizing the benefits of the Mexican Revolution. Here we've got the school teacher in the countryside. And why do you think they have this armed guard here? And let me just repeat, Sally wrote, I think the added shade to the colors add to the gloominess, especially the body language. Yeah, I see that too, with it sort of the brushiness, and it just seems to emotionalize the forms a little more. And of course, also because we see fewer figures, we can kind of see them in a sort of realistic setting. They're doing, they're sort of acting, and they're, what would you say? They're combined in a setting without there being too many people. It just feels more realistic than having 1,000 people brushing shoulders. So maybe it's just, that's part of the emotionalism to this. So here, why do you think that armed guard is there? In fact, that is an armed guard protecting those people there. Who do you think he's protecting them from? Is it coyotes? I suppose it could be coyote. It's probably the landowners, the people, just like any revolution usually is because there's oppressed, marginalized mass of people. Usually the upper classes don't want to educate the lower classes, because as soon as you educate the lower classes or the oppressed or the marginal, you're going to have a maybe revolutionary mindset in the lower classes. So that happened in apartheid in South Africa, in the United States after the Civil War. The South didn't want freed slaves to be educated, because as soon as you educate someone, they become literate, they might become a lawyer, and they might become a contributor or a sort of stakeholder in the system. So that soldier's probably protecting the class. Very kind of disturbing to sort of see the need for protection for just a basic education. I think that really makes this picture very powerful, just because you sort of have to reconcile the classroom adjacent to a figure who's protecting them. Moving along, I don't want to spend too much time on this mural, but just to show that you can see how colorful this mural is, and that's partly because you can see down the very first floor, he's sort of still developing his fresco technique from Europe, and by the time he gets to the top floor, you could see how his colors get very vibrant, and really he's sort of, I think, really mastered this technique, and you can see him really, I think, exploring the technique now that he's mastered it. And this is a very positive picture. I think, this one is a great example of sort of visualizing a sense of national unity. Visualizing these two Mexicans coming together. One is wearing maybe the outer garment of a worker, proletariat. The other on the right, he's got a sickle, sort of a Soviet reference, but also a reference to harvesting. So probably you have a farmer on the right and a worker on the left. And I guess this would be like the nation, the arms extended in the background. So, a wonderful example of visualizing a sense of Mexican unity. Of course, the person on the far left and right look a little hesitant, but I think it's look at how beautiful it looks with these murals inside of it. You almost couldn't imagine the building without these murals. And this is a very neoclassical building with these arches. You'll see a lot of this in Latin America. This is a very bizarre looking building. And on the inside, this is a really, I mean, what do you think about this one? What's your first response when you see this? It looks like a church to me, unless I'm a chapel. It's a little different than what we saw in other examples, especially when you think about this one here, how many figures he's sort of stuffed into the frame. When we get back to this one, it's really much more of a kind of, I feel like he's exploring the scale of different figures. The red is really overpowering, and maybe that's why he's using so much of that blue. And I really think of one of the more fascinating questions for me with all these Mexican muralists is sort of the way this red and blue, I see this kind of pop up here and there. And I wonder if some of these each of these different muralists discovers red and blue because it's such a powerful dynamic color combination that functions really well on mural format, because when something's so far away or something so big on a wall, it helps to have two colors that really push things back and pull things forward. The red jumps out, the blue recedes. And yet I still see Diego Rivera kind of here exploring sort of, he wants to add depth. I think here he's sort of reducing the number of figures, perhaps in response to maybe what he was doing in previous examples. But let's see what more. So this is one of, I love this, this is really, this almost has a Frida Kahlo quality. It's almost like a surrealist response to the Mexican Revolution, because there's recognizable things. It looks like Emiliano Zapata there on the left. They're both underground, but they're fertilizing the corn. And I mean, there's a lot of layers of sort of mythology here. This is the Diego Rivera I really love, when he almost simplifies things and reduces things to more kind of clarity. So this is I think partly because he's using the constrained by maybe the limits of the church here. He clearly can't do big, huge, ambitious things with a lot of figures. But I think he's also being more expressive, like with the figures you see here. It's just interesting. There's all these nude figures in a church. Also, you might notice on the very top above, he's got the hammer and the sickle. These two figures fighting with the hammer and the sickle. So this is definitely, I think, him maybe exploring and trying things out, and definitely trying to insert some communism wherever he can into his paintings. And I think you could really see the influence of Diego Rivera on Frida Kahlo, and maybe, of course, vice versa. But I think that's a fascinating question: is like, how did Diego Rivera influence Frida Kahlo. And yeah, someone points out he takes a more is less approach. Yeah, that's a good way of maybe a good filter through which to filter some more of the pictures we see, whether or not he's going with a less is more approach and what's the advantage of one versus the other. Um, yeah, this we'll get back to some more murals so we can think about that. This is just one of many, so I don't want to get too hung up on all of them. But here's Frida Kahlo, and you could see her really transform, I think, from this sort of more European kind of a more modern look that she has here to the Frida Kahlo we all know. And I wouldn't be surprised if that had, to a degree, had as it's because the influence of Diego Rivera really valorizing her mestiza identity. And you'll see her shift from this look to sort of the look of her cutting off all of her hair and wearing Diego Rivera's outfit to, again, returning to this Frida Kahlo we see on the right here in one of his later murals in San Francisco. So it seems to me that in this painting by Frida Kahlo, this is before she met Diego, that you can almost see this is how she kind of portrayed herself before meeting him. It looks like maybe he sort of validated some of this sort of or maybe he told her, hey, you look great wearing these outfits. But it seems like there's something about her outward transformation that has to do with her meeting Diego Rivera around now. And I think it's, again, an interesting question how she influenced him, because she definitely must have had a big influence. But I'm looking for that influence beyond just sort of inserting her into the picture where he normally puts the other female figure looking out, doing something coy or flirtatious. So here they are. Here's a wedding photo. So this is around the time when they met. And this isn't, I think this is shortly after her accident with the bus. I don't want to focus on Frida Kahlo so much, but certainly this is around the time when they finally get married. And of course, painting becomes a major part of her life. And, having Diego around as a, very skilled painter must have certainly kind of been a synergistic effect on both of them. And here you can see them both sort of looking over each shoulders at their paintings. And, I think that's just wonderful to have, anytime there's an artist with another artist, I think it's just such a wonderful formula for having a source of refreshing insight into your work. And you can even see her transformation on the left here, a little more modern garb, to the right, a little more mestiza. That it might just be what she's wearing in the photograph, but I think you could see that they both have a really important impact on each other's artwork. And remember, with Diego Rivera, the whole point of these Mexican murals, like with Orozco and Siqueiros, is to visualize this sense of Mexican identity. Jose Vasconcelos is the Minister of Education, who hires these muralists to paint murals that visualize Mexican history for the illiterate. And so knowing this, it helps explain a little better why Diego Rivera wants to cram as much into this very famous mural at the Palacio Nacional. Maybe it's not at the Ministerio de Educación, but either way, he's visualizing Mexican history here. So what about this one? Do you feel a lot of emotion here? Is there a focal point? It definitely is very ambitious. For me, this almost reads like an abstract painting. There's so much going on. For me, if I look at this in terms of him trying to thoroughly, comprehensively collect all of Mexican history into one location, so that the average Mexican, maybe when visiting the capital city for whatever reason, maybe you have to go to the capital to get some paperwork done, or to attend court, or do some kind of administrative task. You see this mural and maybe you're reminded that you learn about Mexican history, because otherwise, how would you learn Mexican history unless you were educated? Because the other alternative would be someone telling you Mexican history, but it's a lot easier. You hit a lot more people when you have a mural that is so accessible. So what do you think? What's your take on this mural? What would you say is the focal point here?
I don't think that there's much of a focal point. It's more like a crash course of an illustration of Mexican history and combining it into one. But if I had to pick a focal point, I would say the first thing that caught my eye is the eagle in the center.
And of course, that's the eagle from Aztec mythology on the cactus thing you see on the flag. So a fitting thing to put in the middle as a sort of unifying sort of focal thing. I mean, of course, we don't necessarily see that as a focal point, perhaps because it's a little flat. It feels more like kind of a maybe a almost like a car's hood ornament rather than maybe an actual eagle. But he is kind of the eagle is looking at us, so there's a minor set of engagement, but it doesn't really unify everything the same way, perhaps. In other paintings, you will see Diego Rivera as a central figure unifying everything. And I think that's the tricky thing for me. I think if you see this in person, there's no question that this all makes sense. But when I see it here on screen, it's overwhelming, to say the least. And I don't think that's necessarily a negative. Um, but I think perhaps, because there's so much going on, and maybe the space itself is, meant to be almost is so symmetrical that it's hard to necessarily get a sense of chronology. It's almost like all the history is converging into the middle. And if it does it capture Mexico's very sort of colorful, chaotic history of especially the 1800s. Yes. So in that sense, I think it's hard to really have any sense of moral clarity when it comes to history. And I think he's, I think faithfully translated that to pictorial form here. But I think this is this is probably classic Rivera, which is what a lot of people might think of when they think of Rivera. A lot of figures sort of stuffed onto a wall, and he's really trying to give you this almost very ambitious view of, I think, as you said, a crash course of history. And it's effective, very effective in that sense. And each of these little niches in these sort of reminiscent of the Sistine Chapel with stuffing all this stuff, visually intoxicating kind of experience. But I think you could see, like, when you with Michelangelo, even he understands the sort of value of isolating figures, having a space in between them, and especially using the body as a sort of a source of emotion. And you could see some are more clear than others, some are more visually digestible, clear than others. And he's learning as he's going along. So I think likewise, Diego Rivera will be learning from kind of both from his own experience in Italy and in Europe, but also as he's working through these murals. So like this, for instance, reminds me of having Jesus in the middle, as a focal point connecting everything. But even in the one on the left, which is the Last Judgment, you have a sense of up and down. You go to heaven or you go to hell. Whereas with the Diego Rivera, there's no real clear backdrop, no sense of up and down. It's a little more of like just sort of everything is on stage all at once for the big stage, for the bow, for the curtain call. But when I see this angle, it's really exciting. You have to kind of you appreciate that experiencing the mural isn't really this this so much as walking up the stairwell. First you see this, and then you can imagine it expands to the left and to the right. And so I think you really have to appreciate these murals in person to truly appreciate what he's trying to do. Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on this because we'll get back to at least part of this in a moment. But I think I just want to again point out that in some cases he's got figures in a more believable environment. Here it's a little more clear that they're in some kind of space. Looks like perhaps ancient Mexico, pre-Columbian Mexico, and he has some sense of a backdrop, a volcano, and that sort of flying serpent. It almost reminds me of like an Indian god. But here, it's. I think he wanted to get as much in as possible, but because of that, none of it exists in a sort of recognizable landscape, and so it's all very sort of busy, like almost like a battle scene. It kind of reminds me of that battle scene in the Bonampak murals we saw with the Maya warriors fighting. It's got the same sense of chaos, and so these figures are all kind of jumbled together, and I don't really get any real no emotional standouts here, either from the human beings or even from any of these scenes, because I think it all sort of it's so there's so much going on and nothing quite stands out more than others. But again, I think that's all because his overarching goal is to include every part of a Mexican history here. And I think you can see the difference between this, which is a little more free, a little more breathing room than in the central mural. Here you can see some of so you can see the organization is, I guess, from left to right above, but of course down below it's a little more of a kind of hodgepodge of different elements of Mexican history. So, the chronology is even kind of, on the top, it's left to right, down the bottom, it's sort of like it's all sinking into the salad bowl of history. And above, you can see these are little highlights of what's going on from those sections. So he's definitely organizing, the history into little pods, little modules, not to quote Canvas. And here's the eagle. And, that's a little more emotional when I get a little closer to the eagle. But I don't feel, it's totally got the same, it's almost like the flirtatious horse. You've got these flirty eyes of those horses that we saw, which we'll see again. So let's just keep going on because we'll see this mural again. So might compare that to this. And, this is sort of the US version of, what's going on in Mexico with a muralist trying to galvanize a sense of American identity. And I think Benton is using a little more sort of emotional. He's giving leaving a little more breathing room around the figures than Diego Rivera is, for instance, in something like this. And maybe the figures are a little more kind of, he's playing with scale, and the figures for me are a little more expressive. They don't have that Botero like kind of puffiness that makes them a little more kind of, I don't know what you call they're more mythological figures than here, which I see as these don't look realistic either, but they're more kind of emotional because he's adding maybe more sinewy kind of limbs, and there's more kind of, I think, expressiveness in each of the sort of figure, the body, the shape of the body. And this is maybe me, or they're splitting hairs, or just my own subjective opinion, but there's something just a little more expressive about the bodies, and I kind of recognize each of them a little more. They're a little more individualized. So that's something to maybe think about when we see Rivera's work and how it transforms when he comes to the United States, because I think you'll see his work does transform. So he does go back and add another element, another wall on the south side of this mural, but that's after he goes to the United States in 1931 with 1930, I think, with Kahlo. There's 1930. So here's the part that he adds later. So we'll revisit this afterwards. So yeah, he goes to the United States in 1930. He's a big celebrity, I think, at this point. They go by train, which is neat. Kind of, we've looked at how trains connect the United States and Mexico. I think that sounds like a great way to go to Mexico. I'm not sure if you can do that, but I'd like to think you could. So remember, the United States in the 1930s. What's going on in the 1930s? Well, you got the Great Depression. A lot of people lost work because of the stock market crash in 1929. In 1930s, you got the Dust Bowl. So it's an interesting time to be bringing Mexican muralists, or several Mexican muralists, for that matter, to the United States, because a lot of Americans don't have work. I think this is a great photo from that period showing I feel like I've seen this ad before too. People waiting in line with this picture of prosperity in the back. And here, more pictures of people waiting in line for probably food, unemployment checks. And, this is a reality of the United States in the 1930s. They're literally deporting people of Mexican descent, because that's sort of kind of what happens when you have rampant unemployment, or maybe not what happens, but you can kind of understand that in a time of unemployment, the country is much more likely to clamp down on immigration, or to be more strict about what kinds of who gets what kind of work visas, because it's not just people coming to the United States necessarily undocumented, but also getting work visas to work on farms, and a lot of skilled labor. When I was in the Peace Corps, most of the Guatemalans I met had come to the United States with a work visa to help with agriculture and things like that. Almost everyone I know knew there had come to the United States. So really, the United States is constantly trying to benefit from cheap labor from other countries, because corporations don't want to pay American workers, that when you can get cheaper labor. So at this time, when Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo are coming to the United States, there's definitely a lot of animosity towards foreign workers because of the Depression. So in this picture, you could see people waving behind to Mexicans who are expelled back to Mexico. So, he's sort of going against the grain, Diego Rivera, when he's coming to the United States. Well, why is he coming to the United States? Well, remember, this is the period leading up to World War II. And so the likes of the Rockefellers want to create good relations with Mexico so that they can have unobstructed access to Mexican oil, and also so that the Nazis don't invade Mexico and then invade across the US border or something like that. So And also keep in mind that's the sort of historical backdrop, but remember that artistically, you've got this sort of cross-pollination with artists in the United States who are very curious and fascinated by the artwork, the output by our neighbor in the South, in Mexico. And a whole bunch of American artists are definitely sort of looking to find their own uniquely American sort of mark to make in the world, just like Mexican artists want to sort of create a Mexican, that sort of Mexican art that's fitting for Mexican identity. So here you're sort of going to see, I think, sort of this wonderful kind of struggle to find a sort of fitting visual vocabulary for the new world, including kind of North America, South America, or at least I think Diego Rivera is trying to sort of maybe emulate what he did in Mexico, but in the United States and for an American audience, and tackling subject matter, which is obviously not Mexican subject matter. So, what we just saw is, Mexican history art that's intended to visualize Mexican history for Mexicans. So what are we looking at here? What's his objective here, do you think, with this mural in San Francisco that he makes in 1931? Here we are. Well, it looks like he's focused. Well, who's he focusing on? Who are these people? And another thing to think about is also, what does Diego Rivera think about technology? And maybe that question you can look at later. But when you look at this painting, you see, is he celebrating the lower classes? Are these oppressed people? Are these, the rich capitalist overlords? Are these capitalist oppressors? What's the overall kind of, I think this is a positive picture about these people, but who are these people? Looks like they're building the Golden Gate Bridge there on the right, by the way. Yes, Maggie.
They're just middle class workers.
Yeah, I don't know if it's, I don't know if maybe lower class, middle class. One of the interesting things about, say, Henry Ford, people call it Fordism. The idea is sort of, I guess you call it having an articulated economy is when the workers can afford to buy that which they produce on the assembly line. So Ford's contribution to the economy was, or economic principles was, he wanted his workers to be able to afford to buy the cars that the assembly line produced. And that way, the idea was to pay the workers enough to be able to buy the products that they produce. And that created a good, a positive cycle of what you might call an articulated economy, where you're basically, your workers can benefit from all their labor. The alternative to that would be Ford saying, oh, wait, I can actually pay my workers less and outsource these factories to other countries and pay them less, and then import the raw materials, or outsource the labor, import the raw materials. You can see how that's sort of globalization. And so that's very different than Ford's idea, which is sort of pay your workers enough so that they can afford to buy the stuff you're creating. And I think you kind of see Rivera fascinated by the technology and by the sort of the productivity of the United States because of the use of technology. And I think it's a very positive picture. Would you agree of people working here, Maggie? Anything negative here?
I can't really say anything. That would
Yeah, me neither. It almost, maybe I see some people dangling on a string there on the back, on the upper right. I don't think, I might be misreading that, but it looks like, I see progress. They're building buildings. That looks like the iron truss work for a steel truss for a building. He's made this wonderful illusion of a scaffold, but people are sort of working on a mural, which is a lot of fun. Down below, there's sort of, looks like we've got not a, what's the word, a smith, an anvil. But it looks like a picture of sort of happy people who are productive and unified. And, maybe you might tend to want to think that anyone who's pro-communist would be against anything capitalistic. But I think the idea is technology and working is good as long as you're working for your own benefit and not just for the benefit of profit-making capitalist overlords. So I think in a way you could see this as Diego Rivera saying, oh no, capitalism is good in the sense that people are working together and making innovation. But the bad thing about capitalism, maybe when you have these workers being oppressed. So I think this is probably why Diego Rivera got a lot of slack, a lot of criticism from his fellow communists, because I think he was on one hand hired, commissioned by people like the Detroit auto industry to make murals with the Rockefellers, but also because in a way he's almost making a positive vision of work and working together. But I think you can separate, working together from maybe capitalism, because of course in communism you still have to have work and have industry and innovate. So you could say he's sort of not necessarily supporting capitalism here so much as supporting the idea of everyone having a job and everyone feeling like they're contributing and producing. So yeah, so you could see that Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo get married around this time, and we'll probably look at this painting again when we get to Frida Kahlo. But what would you say about their relationship here? How does Frida Kahlo visualize their relationship?
She looks kind of like an accessory to him in this.
Say it again, Emma. I didn't quite hear you.
Like an accessory to him, almost.
What do you mean by that?
Like he's holding the paintbrushes and the palette, whereas she's just kind of wearing this really nice outfit.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that it will be interesting to see how that changes. I think, when you first meet someone, when you first get married, maybe there's maybe at this moment, maybe she felt happier, or maybe this was sort of just an early form of her, how she identifies as herself with this band kind of thing. And maybe early on, there was sort of one relationship, and then as it evolves, that relationship evolves. And so this could just be one snapshot of early on. And yeah, I get the same sense that, she's kind of more of like a sidekick here. He's got the brushes. She doesn't. She's not totally holding his hand, you notice, and she's slightly nodding to him, tilting her head to him. But I think the more interesting thing is how this relationship evolves, because this, for me, doesn't really look like the Frida Kahlo that we'll recognize later, who's very much more independent. And but I think but I don't think she's totally committed, just in the way their hands aren't totally clasped together. But that'll be interesting to see how that changes as they spend time in the United States, because Frida Kahlo, as you probably remember from the painting we saw of her at the border, she does not like the United States. Oh, and your midterm question, I think Diego Rivera was a lot happier schmoozing with the people. I think, while he was painting, she would often have to schmooze with the other kind of Anglo women from Detroit. And I think she felt very much like a fish out of water. And I think, as you probably know, Frida Kahlo is a very sort of chic, sophisticated lady, and with an artist with her own kind of sophistication. And that's so different than your sort of country club jet set, whether it's in New York or Detroit. And she must have just, imagine being Frida Kahlo, and you take this trip, and maybe you're in Detroit, a cold, freezing, kind of miserable place in the middle of December, and while your husband's working, she has to sort of schmooze and sort of socialize with people who she really doesn't want to be around. And so that would make the fact that Diego Rivera ends up cheating on her with this famous tennis player all the more kind of mean spirited, because here she is sort of having to go through the motions of socializing and being a good, obedient wife, or whatever you want to call her here. And then, of course, he cheats on her. So that must add so much insult to the agony to the insult. But I think this is definitely the most dainty you'll see Frida Kahlo in the pictures, because as time goes on, she clearly kind of, I think, has a much more kind of strained relationship with him. So here we are in Detroit. And I think this is going to be for me personally, one of my favorite murals by Diego Rivera. He gets paid $20,000 for this mural, which you can compare with the $4,000 he gets paid in San Francisco. And as you probably know, this is not adjusted for inflation. I don't know how much it would be now. I'm guessing probably about $1 million, maybe $500,000, somewhere around there. But more importantly, this kind of money in Mexico goes a really long way back in 1930. So, he's going to be making a lot of money on this gig. And this might be the reason why he gets denounced by a lot of the left, because now he's, of course, working for the capitalist overlords, the Detroit auto industry. And it's a beautiful mural. Like I said, this sort of it combines the best of both styles we've seen. The less is more, which you see a little bit on the top on the above part, but on below you see more of that ambition of including lots of figures. But even now, I will say those plants have got to go. Please get rid of those plants. Or maybe they're okay, but I feel like they may be a different kind of plant. Of course, it's low lighting, but that's always something you might just have to deal with as an artist working in an environment. Such a wonderful room, a self-contained room with this wonderful overhead lighting, which keeps it all really well lit with natural lighting. So that's I can forgive the plants, which look like poinsettias or something like that. And the murals themselves, like I said, for me, these are really one of my favorite, not my favorite Diego Rivera, but maybe my second or third favorite. And there's something going on here that I haven't seen him do in the other ones as effectively. And for me, it's, what do you guys think? What do you think about this mural? What's different about this one perhaps than previous ones that we've seen? And or do you think this one's has anything more effective about it than the other ones? And however you choose to define effective. A lot of people came to see these murals, like tens of thousands of people flocked into this room, on any given Sunday to come see the work by this famous Mexican muralist. And maybe what else are you going to do in Detroit in the middle of winter? But I still think that's not to say that his work was incredibly popular, and deservingly so, because he's doing something here that he's doing things here that we haven't seen necessarily. At least I don't think so, quite in the same way as his other murals. Partly, I think it's the movement. The workers are all working, and they're all working in one kind of setting that is a real setting. And so he's not just sort of accumulating people to sort of look outward, and it's not this thorough kind of crash course in history. If you remember from your reading, he spent a lot of time brushing shoulders with these workers, looking at the different components of their work and the things they're creating. And I think he really does a lot of justice to sort of integrating, being a participant observer with these workers. And that translates into this really wonderful work that shows his observation of all this time spent in this environment. What do you think? Any observations here? Is there one focal point here? Is there any emotion in this picture? Is there something going on here that different than other paintings? I can see a few things already that also coming to mind. I want to hear what you guys think.
One of the things that I noticed is perhaps perspective.
Yeah,
Like
that's
to clutter things all together.
Yeah, you notice, you might, I don't want to scroll through a bunch of slides, but yeah, when we talk, explain what you mean by that.
Well, it has more dimension because if you looked at the one with the city hall, it just on top of each other, like like next to each other, and then this one is just straight through. People are overlaying each other and covering each other.
So that sort of three-dimensional one-point perspective space with this vanishing point in the back, and all the environment really flows out of that sort of adherence to perspective, the rules of perspective. So things that are close are bigger, things that are farther away are shrunken, rather than everything being flat on the same surface. So remember, this goes back to what I was saying about modernism. He spent a lot of time in Europe, and if you're a European modernist in 1920s, depth is a no depth. It's no illusion. But of course, that's sort of, you're in the epicenter of the art world, where the purest of pure form. And that works in Paris in 1930s, 1920s, but in the New World here in the United States or in Mexico, I think Diego Rivera is starting to kind of let go of some of that need to make everything flat, because I think he realizes there's something wonderful to be achieved by kind of making the mural a space for illusion, which is to say the illusion of depth. Because who am I kidding? Like, why just get rid of depth just because it's depth? You could also get rid of color. It's sort of pick and choose which tools you want to use. But I think embracing depth, I'm so happy that he went back to depth, because some of the things you can see he achieves, it's not just the depth, but you notice on the right side of this machinery, the light from above is reflecting onto the machinery. You notice that? So now that he's created this real environment, you've also got a real light source. And I don't see that light source in other paintings, where it's clear that the sort of lighting from this from wherever the light source is falling equally on all the subjects. Whereas now that he's got this light source in the very back, which is like the cauldron, the crucible of iron, the forge, the bright light is actually shining onto the objects in the environment. So that again puts me in a believable environment and makes it more real. So I'm so glad he's getting rid of this need to make everything so flat, because when he opens up the space, it feels more believable and feels like I'm actually kind of in an environment. I can hear the machines. I can hear the far off sounds. I can hear the sizzle of like that of the flames. I can hear the metal clanking, and I can almost smell the sweat of the men in the foreground, and I can feel them heaving and pushing in unison. And so it almost connects the human machinery to the machinery in the background. And by the way, what are they making here?
Looks like engine blocks.
Yeah, you're more precise than I would know. An engine dock. I didn't even know that. I think maybe I've heard that term. But yeah, I guess part of the car's engine, right? Assembly line. So this would really be like, Henry Ford. Of course, maybe Detroit isn't Ford, but one of the car companies. Where are these jobs today?
In Mexico.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know if there's much more to say about that. There's certain irony to that, and it's wonderful in a way. I think Diego Rivera, if you brought him up, from the grave today, you told him these jobs are in Mexico, he'd be like, "Let me go paint them." now I can paint this in Mexico, and I think he would love that, because I think, Milton. Let me ask you, what do you think? What does Diego Rivera think of technology, just based on this picture alone?
I mean, if I had to like interpret, there is like a futurism like kind of quality where I think that he sees promise in like this technology. I think his issue is the way we exploit people to like have widespread access to said technology.
Yeah, and he might be adding more of a sense of racial harmony than actually existed. He might be uh, this might be more aspirational than the reality. If I remember from your reading, I think he actually sort of offered a vision of more racial unity, because I'm not sure how integrated the workforce actually was. So this could be more aspirational. From your
So it
reading. Yeah,
so
go
it
on.
depended on who you worked for. Like from what I understand, Ford was more racially, I think, diverse and equal opportunity than most other places at the time.
Interesting.
And that was like one of the things that a lot of people liked about working at Ford. At the same time, like Ford himself could be tyrannical, and he had all of his like strict rules and stuff that he had to follow, like his own like Protestant like ideals and
Right.
whatever.
But it sounds like Ford was a little better than, at least he had a sense of merit over sort of,
Yeah.
he understood, okay. And I think that's an interesting part of the United States, the sort of idea that, capitalism or the assembly line kind of only cares about the final product, in a way that they talk, you hear this in feminism in the 1960s with marketing to women who are joining the workforce in the 1960s, in the way, they only care about women as sort of a demographic to purchase things, rather than preserving the older sort of barriers, the gender kind of specialization. So you could think about integration of the races during time of war, or even sports, and how sports and working have this sort of, you can transcend racial divisions by focusing on, productivity and work. And certainly in World War II, you see integration of the army, the armed forces, and also women joining the workforce, because you could see how technology and capitalism kind of definitely have this sort of disruptive quality at time of war, or at least war could be very disruptive to those boundaries. And so maybe Henry Ford was just sort of kind of one element in this very complicated picture of capitalism, which of course also included, the very oppressive Deep South. And I'm sure you wouldn't have seen this kind of vision of integration in any businesses in the South. But I do think that, Diego Rivera seemed to really admire American technology. But I don't think it's necessarily him admiring, like you said, it's not capitalism so much of him admiring people feeling a sense of pride in their work and being able to produce things, and making, one thing I forgot to mention a while back about Frida Kahlo is, while she's very critical of the United States and feels very much like a fish out of water, she does return to the United States to seek medical treatment. And the medical treatment is a lot better than what she gets in Mexico. And of course, ironically, today people go to Mexico now for a lot of dentistry and things because it's cheaper. But I think certainly Frida Kahlo would have said it was a great thing to come to the United States to benefit from some of the health care that she received, because if I remember, her doctor in Mexico really did a lot of bad work on her spine. So and I think all of us probably feel the same ambivalence about the United States has a lot of creature comforts, a lot of material comforts, but at the same time we're missing kind of maybe that sense of folklore, a sense of folk kind of tradition, or deeper cultural meanings, or values that aren't just based on materialism and innovation and having the coolest Google glasses and earbuds and iPhone 15. But I think Diego Rivera certainly would have said probably that, or probably would have said, not certainly, probably would have said that this technology would be great in Mexico if Mexico could sort of benefit. And you'll actually see that he's sort of almost visually comparing some of these machinery to some of the Aztec statues and statuary that we'll see. So let's look at a little more of this mural. I think this side is not as impressive as this side for me personally. I think partly because he really activates that depth, especially having the bright forge in the background. Yeah, is it too late to it's funny. Bailey mentioned that Ford was anti-Semitic. I knew that about. I'm not sure. Is Detroit? Are we looking at Ford? I can't remember. Is this actually the Ford factory? Yes. If I remember, Frida Kahlo went up to Ford and asked him if he was Jewish, as a way to insult him, because she knew he was anti-Semitic. And in Mexico, I think there's probably a lot less anti-Semitism than there was in the United States at this time. And yes, I believe, it could be that. I think it was Ford was notoriously anti-Semitic. Of course, how that plays out when we get to World War II is very interesting, because I think Henry Ford was one of the people who really funded a lot of Hitler's technological advances, and then helped the Soviet Union too, if I remember, building factories in the Soviet Union. So, in a way, it's almost like you could see how self-interest versus sort of racism versus, bigotry kind of have this sort of, they triangulate, or they sort of balance, and they change according to, of course, self-interest usually seems to win out over everything else. But yeah, I think I remember a famous anecdote with Frida Kahlo kind of giving Ford the needle, if you will, kind of ribbing him for his anti-Semitism. But I think, anti-Semitism has been very common, and, anti-Semitism typically refers to anti-Jewish behavior or sentiment. I think technically it might refer that Semites could technically refer to people beyond the Jewish faith in a technical sense, but I think in vernacular it refers to anti-Jewish sentiment, feelings, anything. And this is throughout human history, going all the way back to the expulsion of the Jews from Egypt in the biblical times, into Spain in 1400s, and then France, the Disraeli, can't remember the crisis that happened in late 1800s in France, and then of course the Jews settled in Germany, and now of course in Israel you have the conflict where with the land taken, quote unquote, from the Palestinians. And I think that's really, you have to look at the creation of the state of Israel in the context of this anti-Semitism leading up to the Holocaust in the 1940s. So we'll talk about that a little more when we get past the 1940s. But yeah, I think Henry Ford, I'm sure, was very, very when there's a quote, behind any great fortune is a great crime. And it's maybe it's when you become this sort of, I think Milton mentioned, he's tyrannical. So yeah, I'm sure Henry Ford was not a very sort of someone necessarily who has any sense of a kind of perfect character. And I think the Rockefellers likewise had their own agenda, have their own axe to grind. I'm not sure if they are known for their anti-Semitism, but I think you're right, Bailey, that Henry Ford was famous for being anti-Semitic. So this one, is very different than the other one, or it's similar in the sense of the movement. And I think that movement is really something that really benefits Diego Rivera's work. you really feel the struggle. Like I don't see a lot of musculature in the other figures we saw in the other paintings, whereas in this one, I could see the muscles and the arms of the figures. And so there's a lot more emotion in the actual physical movement of the figures. And I wonder if that's Diego Rivera sort of just adapting to the sort of the needs of visualizing America or the Detroit auto factory in terms of movement and sense of unity. But I think that's just again his work evolving, adding more depth, letting go of the modernism. On the right, you can see that machine looks almost like starting to look like an Aztec god, maybe Coatlicue, and we'll see that in a later version. So here, I think this figure in the middle stands out a little more than in his paintings. Usually you don't have one figure standing out. So there's almost angelic light on this figure. And yeah, it looks like they're building a car, what's it called, a chassis, that part of the bottom part of the car. And this would be, if you did this today, maybe they'd be building electric cars, right? But you could see the people in the background literally coming to watch the factories. If I remember, Diego Rivera thought it was really silly that Americans would come to the factory just to sort of be like tourists watching people work. And honestly, when I read that, I'm like, yeah, I think that's absolutely what Americans would do. I could totally, for me, it's not hard at all to imagine Americans, like middle-class Americans, wanting to go, especially in the Midwest, wanting to go to visit a factory to see, how the cars are made. I think that's very like a Midwestern thing. Maybe in San Francisco, not as common. Maybe in New York, New Yorkers would love to go see the latest art show or the latest exhibition, no question. But I think in the Midwest, this is like a good time to go. I don't know if anyone's from the Midwest, you want to disagree, but even today, I could see Midwesterners lining up to go see how anything is made, just because there's sort of fascination with work and creating things. And I think even today on YouTube, you go on YouTube, there's a lot of channels that are dedicated to, all kinds of niche industries, because there's something fast. You know what the equivalent is? It's like people watching construction workers. That's sort of a cliche of people watching people do construction. So I don't know. I don't see anything weird about people wanting to see how things are made. But Diego Rivera thought that was very bizarre, that Americans would want to spend their leisure time watching people work. I don't know if you remember that from the
But I
reading.
do think that during the 1930s, cars were very much still a novelty.
Good
So
point.
just seeing
Yeah.
how they're made is
Yeah,
pretty
yeah,
impressive.
that's a great point. It's like this is like rocket technology, so it could just be sort of, they're fascinated by maybe not everyone owned a car then. It was still maybe a new thing. And yeah, so maybe the equivalent would be looking at how rockets are made over at Cape. If you guys have never been to Cape Canaveral, oh yeah, I highly recommend it. Take a visit. Bring your sketchbook, because you will be confronted by the scale of technology that you will never see again, because these rockets, which are the Gemini rockets, the Jupiter rockets, the Apollo rockets, are there to be seen in the segments, the component parts. And when you go there, you will never feel smaller in your whole life, because these rockets are so big that it just defies logic, the scale of this technology. So since you're close, I highly recommend while you're at school at Ringling to take a visit over to the Cape Canaveral to see how the sort of all these component parts of the space race really. Maybe you have to figure out a time to go, but you can take a bus tour around there. But yeah, that's a good point. This is all maybe very new technology, so they're sort of fascinated by this sort of new, the shock of the new, the thrill of the new. But I don't know if you guys agree or not, but I feel like these paintings here feel like he's really kind of making a big, maybe not a leap forward, but making definitely strides forward as far as adjusting his style according to the subject matter, and a lot more movement, a lot more of a realistic setting, and a lot more of that depth that we were talking about. And of course, I think he's including some of the higher ups and management in these pictures. It's very different the way he treats technology than Orozco. Orozco is very much like, has a nightmarish vision of machinery, and a lot more kind of contrast in the darks and the lights. For me, these almost remind me of like knights in armor, the same kind of silvery sheen. And I think there's no doubt he's kind of almost conflating visually the technology here with Aztec gods, Aztec statues that we'll see later. And again, a celebration of people working. there's some of the Art Nouveau quality to their Art Deco quality, some of the hairstyle there. It looks like these are all women either working or can't remember from the reading what exactly they're doing. Either medical stuff, but it's definitely a celebration of technology and working together. Some of this I think caused controversy. I think it was this one on the upper left. I can't remember what it was about this. I think the more interesting controversy is what we'll see in New York. But it could be sort of treating, it looks like science, the triumph of science. And Diego Rivera certainly wasn't at all religious. He's a devout atheist. So maybe some of the people knew this about him, some Americans, and you're in a very sort of probably more religious part of America when you get to Detroit back in this time. So it could be that people were just looking for any excuse to be upset. Again, this is a time when a lot of Americans are struggling for work. Diego Rivera is a foreigner getting commissioned to paint American subject matter. So there could be some of that kind of falsely fueling, the controversy. You notice the flirtatious eyes of the cow and the horse there. Again, that's something we'll see in a lot of his work. I think that's definitely a motif. But there's definitely a child being vaccinated here. That could be what's happening. The triumph of science. And, again, this controversy follows him around. I think, as you saw from the reading, a lot of it's self-generated controversy, not necessarily from Diego Rivera so much as, the people involved had a certain political opportunism. And in a way, in some cases, like in this case, it led to more people flocking to come see the murals, as you probably know, and as we'll see. In New York, you really get the real famous example of Diego Rivera sort of, I think, probably taking more controversial steps, intentionally controversial steps after the major success here in Detroit. I think he's sort of maybe taking a few more risks with and maybe responding to some of the criticism about him working on behalf of the capitalist overlords. Especially if people know that Ford is anti-Semitic, I'm sure his communist friends are reminding Diego Rivera of this. And, it's his moral compass is probably, struggling between the notoriety of being in the United States and sort of being a celebrity muralist versus sort of selling out to the sort of capitalist overlords. So let's get to New York, and then we'll take a short break. So we'll take a break in about 5 minutes. But so why would the Rockefellers, who are the ones who commissioned his work in New York, why would they want to improve relations with Mexico? Well, remember the Rockefellers, I think, as Milton said weeks ago, oil. And so oil in Mexico. Rockefeller is the family that founded the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And as you know, wealth and art almost go hand in glove. And that's not a bad thing. You need money in order to build buildings. You need banks in order to raise money to build bridges and all kinds of things. And you definitely have, there are positive things that come out of this marriage between wealth and art. Of course, there's also negative things that come out of the marriage between wealth and art. And I think the Rockefellers are probably a little more, I don't know too much about their history, but maybe they don't have quite the stain of anti-Semitism or working with the Nazis. But I think I think it's probably the wife has a sincere interest in art, and maybe the husband has a little more of an interest in using the politics of the art world to his benefit, and mainly to improve relations with Mexico. And so I think there's a real intention by the Rockefellers especially the John Rockefeller, to bring Diego Rivera to the United States as a way to kind of offer an olive branch to Mexico, to make up for some of the past, we could say, the invasion of Mexico by the United States, or influencing negatively the Mexican Revolution, or just violating the sovereignty of Mexico. So there's a little bit of mending fences here, but for purely political, self-interested reasons. So Diego Rivera is commissioned to make 6 murals, portable frescoes in New York, which is really neat. He makes these frescoes that aren't permanent, but rather they're permanent in the sense they're on sturdy material, but they're really meant to be sort of something he makes specifically for the museum of modern art. And I think, again, you could see they're smaller, and so they have more of a focus on, individual figures, and they're obviously scenes from the Mexican Revolution. And I think, he's the second person who had a solo show at the MoMA. The first person was Matisse. So this is a big deal, and this is kind of the peak Diego Rivera and peak fame and stardom. And when he makes these murals, I think he's, really sort of, this is the moment when Mexican muralism has really arrived on the world stage as a sort of force to be reckoned with. But again, I think it's, it's not necessarily Diego Rivera who will be the ultimate influence on the abstract expressionists, so much as Orozco, but Diego Rivera certainly can claim to be the biggest influence, I think, on the United States' decision to fund artists to make murals as a way to lift Americans out of poverty during the Great Depression, either by symbolically affirming American identity or by literally paying artists to get out of poverty so they have, productive work during the time of the Great Depression. And here are some of the murals that he created. This is, he revisits that subject from before, and this is the one he creates for the MoMA. Here is another one showing sugarcane harvesting. Most of the sugarcane harvesting takes place on the coast of Mexico. We can see the upper class, maybe the hacendero, the owner of the land, reclining on a hammock with his two dogs. And, that's definitely a little different than, maybe the vision of labor that we saw in Detroit. Here you've got sort of the reclining overlord, kind of lazily watching while everyone else does the work. And so it's a little confusing for me. I gotta say, the workers seem like they're kind of happy, they're struggling, but there's no real sense of they're almost there. Some people have said Diego Rivera makes subjects look beautiful rather than emotional, which, it's an interesting way of sort of explaining his approach. But in a way, like by adding the figure reclining above on the hammock, I feel like, okay, now I have to see all the workers in the front as sort of oppressed and sort of underpaid. And yet he's sort of treating them with a similar kind of beauty as everything else in the painting, even though you have this guy on a horse sort of with a whip, and yet you see this child labor in the foreground. So there may be and then this just might be me, but a little bit of kind of not mixed messaging, but maybe different tones, conflicting tones. What do you think? Well, what do you think about that? And then we'll take a break. Do you understand? I think this is, if I compare this to the Detroit example, in the Detroit example, it seems like a total kind of embrace of technology and struggle, or labor, working. Whereas this feels like this is oppression. Sugarcane harvest is very hard and difficult, but it's not like, I feel like it's harder for me to look at this and say, oh, these workers are all happy, they're contributing. This feels more like a picture about exploited labor. What do you think? Am I totally wrong? And yes, you can say, yes, Professor Nixon, you are totally wrong. You see where I'm coming from with that? As far as, yeah, so, it's one of those examples of many with Diego Rivera where, I think he's trying to treat the peon, the average Mexican, with beauty. And it does seem like he's, gives them all these sort of pure white outfits. He kind of elevates them visually, whereas the workers have sort of this sort of less visually conspicuous attire, and maybe they're not treated with the same kind of dignity as maybe the other workers. So maybe there is still a sense of visual hierarchy here. And yet, in a way, I almost feel like that's why they were critical of his Detroit pictures, the left wing, the communists, because he didn't show the equivalent of someone reclining in a hammock in Detroit. Of course, that's probably because the owners of the automobile company commissioned his mural, whereas this one right here wasn't commissioned by the, hacienda owner. It's rather by the MoMA. So maybe he can criticize this subject more safely without upsetting things, which of course will set the stage for the Rockefeller murals at the in the Rockefeller Center in New York, which is where we'll pick up on right after the break. So I will see you guys in, let's say, 10 minutes at 9:55. We'll get it back on board the Diego Rivera train, and we'll get to the Rockefeller mural. So I'll see you guys in just a moment. And if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to stay on the line. So as I was just saying, sort of he's walking this tightrope between being a true communist and dealing with the criticism from the left about him being commissioned by the likes of Henry Ford to make pictures celebrating the auto industry, the capitalism, symbol of capitalism, the automobile industry, versus being a good communist and criticizing the United States. So I think that all comes to a head with the Rockefeller murals, which he does around the same time as when he's making these portable frescoes, which seem to really be focused more on him sort of sharing the history of the Mexican Revolution or some history of Mexico with this sort of New York audience. So, it's similar to what we saw with Orozco doing drawings about the Mexican Revolution and then kind of not whitewashing them, but kind of maybe, what would be the word, making them less violent, focusing on subject matter that's maybe less shocking. And Diego Rivera likewise is sort of trying to share the history of the Mexican Revolution or some parts of Mexican history here. And it's interesting to think about. These are the choices he made to tell the story of Mexico. We've got Zapata with his horse, this sort of angelic vision of Zapata. Of course, he has a sickle, which is a very communist symbol. On the lower right, I see a lot of communism there as far as the banners on the back. The figure of the overalls definitely seems to be a symbolic of proletariat. On the upper part, we saw that one a moment ago, sort of oppressed workers working for sugarcane. Lower left, sort of vision of the Mexican Revolution as a sort of healing or coming to the aid of people who are being violently oppressed. And then, well, what's going on the upper left? That's probably my favorite one. What's going on there? Can you guys see the figure with the teeth on top of another figure on the upper left?
It must
Yeah,
be someone in a costume attacking a knight. So I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so that's probably how he's, it's hard to know exactly what people wore because often textiles and clothing don't survive the art historical record, just like a lot of music is lost because we don't know how it sounded because there wasn't written music, no recorded music. But this is probably an Aztec warrior dressed up in their Aztec sort of garb, symbolic maybe as a jaguar warrior. And this is probably either based on Diego Rivera looking at some of the codices, codex that we saw with the the way the Spanish observed Aztec attire. And he's trying to, translate that with as much accuracy as possible, and much more so than Orozco would have. I think Orozco really wasn't interested in being accurate about some of the details of history, whereas Diego Rivera was very much obsessed with, or at least very interested in resurrecting faithfully any aspects of Aztec histories. And knowing now that this is an Aztec jaguar warrior kind of figure, he's holding a jade dagger and plunging it, looks like, into the neck of the equivalent of Cortez. So this would be very sort of celebrating the Aztec triumph over the conquistadors, maybe either as like wishful thinking or as maybe a moment of triumph, winning the battle but losing the war kind of moment. And I love these frescoes because they're small and they're sort of focused more on these kind of emotional scenes rather than being so ambitious and big like we see with some of his other works. So let's go on to these. I think the next, here's a wonderful picture. I mean, for me, this feels like New York in maybe January, cold. The air is just, not a leaf on any tree. And this feels pretty critical. Frozen assets seems to be a reference to kind of economic terminology. Assets are, economic assets, and frozen assets are, I think, when the banks freeze your assets, like during the Depression, or to control the flow of money. It seems to be the most critical painting of the United States yet. What are we seeing here exactly? What's going on here? You have like the underworld and the overworld. So you do have almost a morality in the sense of up is this sort of superficial, maybe the veneer of capitalism. Yes, Maggie.
I was gonna say it kind of reminds me of I think Dante's Inferno a little bit, like with the different levels of I think it was like heaven and hell, and then
Yeah, and
there's like purgatory.
tell everyone about a little bit about Dante's Inferno, so we all know just sort of what it is.
Dante's Inferno, I believe it was a poem
Hmm.
by Dante Alighieri. I'm not sure if I said his name
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah.
And it involves Dante traveling through the various levels of hell with, I believe, a poet by the name of Virgil.
Yep, you're doing great. Yeah, so he literally goes into hell. Um, First hell, right? And then he eventually, I think, works his way up. I haven't read Purgatorio, or I think most people haven't. I think the Inferno is probably the one that everyone loves, probably because going to hell is more fun than going into heaven, more interesting, more of a story there. And yeah, he literally goes into hell and he's kind of going through the different stages. Eventually, I think he's trying to reunite with his lover, his girlfriend, his wife, Beatrice. But yeah, it's a famous story about him kind of visualizing hell, or at least kind of making literary subject matter out of visiting hell. And you can just imagine how fun it is to read about what hell looks like. And so, yeah, it looks like a visualization of kind of maybe hell, purgatory, and then heaven on the very top. Of course, there's no one figure that we focus on here. So almost we don't have our Virgil, our guide. What's going on with those figures? It looks like either sleeping or something there in the middle. For me, this immediately reminds me of like the migrants in New York right now. I'm just sort of forced into or in some kind of haphazard makeshift shelter. And especially in the winter, you can think of how miserable it must be, and how the decision to come to the United States outweighed the suffering, the potential suffering that might be awaiting you, as a sort of the reality of kind of economic reality, the country you're leaving because there's no opportunities. And yet it looks like New York isn't this really. I wouldn't say this is a positive vision of coming to New York and finding any sort of happiness. And of course, Diego Rivera is kind of in New York as a celebrity painting. So this is not about him at all, so much as, yeah, I think visualizing New York as like the layers of maybe just the invisible underbelly of New York. Who do you think those figures are there in the middle, Maggie?
I would say that I mean they look almost dead, like just corpses, I would
Yeah,
say.
yeah, it could be corpses, could be like this guy's just like watch. It looks like there's a police officer watching over them, and who knows if it's what I don't know what Jay Rivera is necessarily trying to say about it, but it could just be like he's got a lot of flack for his Detroit murals, and now he needs to show the workers as kind of maybe being more oppressed or something. But it definitely seems like he's now shifting towards more of a negative critique of the United States. And I think you could probably dig a lot deeper into this painting. I mean, would you ever want to have that job with that person on the lower left? Probably not, because there's no windows. You're working in a room with a cubicle. I don't even know what that downstairs waiting room is. It looks like a prison. So I think he's maybe going from celebrating work and productivity to being more critical. And that's great. I think there's definitely a lot of room for criticism, as probably more so than maybe even the room for celebrating work. But again, some of these are smaller frescoes, or I think more him sort of talking about Mexican history, and in this case, the woman playing an important role here. I think is a great reflection of Diego Rivera, kind of acknowledging the role of women in war. And famous play Lysistrata is all about women refusing to have sex with their husbands so that they could stop the war. And it's a really wonderful play about women intervening in war to stop the men from their vain fighting. So here's some more examples of some of the work industry. Here's Diego Rivera at work. You can see when you're painting a mural, you're not looking at things from life to paint. You're probably copying a sketch, or you're painting out, filling out the outline. So you could see how it's a little slightly different, or very different than painting from life, as it were. And maybe it's sometimes that's why you might not see a consistent lighting source, for example. But so Man at the Crossroads is a painting I teach every semester with my students in my other class. And they're not art students. They're definitely not as kind of brilliant as you guys are, not to criticize them, and I think they'd agree they're not people who are as interested in the arts. And yet it's really valuable painting to teach because it's such a perfect sort of node in history as far as kind of him struggling with this kind of bipolar world between communism and capitalism at the eve of the Cold War. So we're sort of in the late 1930s here, mid 1930s, approaching late 1930s. Hitler's on the rise in Europe. FDR is trying to, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is trying to lift America out of the poverty of the Great Depression. And Mexico, our neighbor, is sort of still kind of spiteful against us for being so interventionist during the Mexican Revolution. So I think this is the era of the good neighbor policy. We're really trying to mend fences with Mexico, basically to sort of make the world, make the Western Hemisphere safe as we enter World War II. So very much, this is definitely a time of Rockefeller pulling strings, coordinating with FDR, and really having an agenda to make better relations with Mexico in the name of preventing Nazi influence in the Western Hemisphere. But I think there's an even bigger picture in the backdrop, and that's communism is on the rise. And even if we defeat Nazism, and as you probably know, big spoiler alert, the Nazis lose. But after that, then we have to confront this sort of bipolar world of communism and capitalism. And so in a way, Diego Rivera tackling this topic is very clairvoyant of him, very smart, because he's aware of the backdrop of fascism, which is also, communism versus capitalism. And the Rockefellers, as you know, are very much anti-communism because, communism is collective ownership of industry, of public services. The United States today, that might include post office, public school, building roads, military, but everything else is private. And another day when we get past into the Cold War, we'll talk about kind of how that plays out, communism versus capitalism. And in fact, maybe we can talk about that briefly when we look at the Rockefeller Center painting. And what a beautiful view of New York City is a sort of turn up the age of empire. This is the age of the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building. There's something beautiful about the lights in New York. You see that in Broadway Boogie Woogie painting by Mondrian, the sort of the fascination with lights and the glamour of the city. And yet, there's something almost sort of deceptive about it. It's very kind of, all that glitters is not gold. But I think it's easy to sort of succumb to the allure of being in New York and the glamour. And here's the sketch that Diego Rivera made for the Rockefellers. And he had made a sketch for I guess it was the Ford, I can't remember exactly which family, but I think it was the Ford who commissioned him for the Detroit murals. I should remember that. I'm sorry. I don't want to assume it's Freud, but I think it is, right? So this sketch is very different than the final outcome. So I think he's learned from the Detroit experience that he can contribute a sketch or give them a sketch of what he's going to do, and then all he has to do is sort of change his mind and do something different. And so that's kind of what he does here. There's some elements that are retained. You might notice the sort of the statue on the left has a head, the one on the right doesn't. And in a way, I think the overall idea of a balance between two sides is preserved, but the final outcome looks very unlike the sketch that he submitted. And I think, again, that's because he's trying to kind of offer a more critical view of a mural that is more critical of being in the United States rather than celebrating technology. So this is a painting that really, what do you think is, and I think this painting is a lot more successful than his other paintings, even though it does have that sort of ambitious crowding of people. For me, what for you is different about this painting than previous Diego Rivera paintings that we've seen, apart from the criticism, and we'll get to that in a moment. I mean, the criticism within the painting.
I think this image is much more complex than even the one he did, like what is it, the city hall, like the everything with the eagle in the middle.
Yeah, it has a similar, or even more like technology, more people than that one. And almost, but interesting. The figures are all kind of very neatly divided into like this side or that side. On that point there, what do you think those two sides correspond to? Because I think he's clearly distinguishing one side from the other. So what do you think those two sides are that's supposed to be equated with? Well, hold that thought. Keep thinking about that. The one thing I notice here is you got this figure in the middle that really organizes everything. It's sort of like that eagle we saw in the other example, but I feel like there's a little more connection because the subject's kind of looking outward, maybe not right at us, but there's definitely kind of an emotional connection I feel here that unifies everything together, which is to say, whichever the choice is, this side or that side, left or right, the figure in the middle, well, will you tell me, what does the figure in the middle feel about this sort of the pressure of being sort of at the crossroads between these two worlds, or being in control of the joystick of these two sides here?
It kind of reminds me of the cosmic center of the universe, more so like the people are the center of the world, gathering communistic people and then the land and everything else around it.
Like a kind of a funnel, everything funnels into
Yeah.
him. And what is the emotion on that person's face in the center? Is he thrilled?
I
Is
don't
it,
think he has a particular expression. I mean, it's just
What
like
is-
a
I think he looks worried.
yeah, there's something. It's not like, oh yay, it doesn't like feel like hopeful about whatever sort of is being filtered or funneled his way. It feels almost like worried or overwhelmed, or maybe definitely some anxiety. um and he's kind of looking up. It's interesting, the body language that Rivera chose, because he could have had the figure looking right at us. So you have to sort of wonder, why did he choose to have the figure, even though he's definitely facing us, looking up and away, almost like someone who's embarrassed to acknowledge the viewer. And you can keep chewing on that thought as we consider, what are these two almost abstract cruciform, like almost butterfly wings? What are those meant to represent there?
It kind of reminds me of like the non-biblical depiction of angels or whatever, like the spinning like circles or whatever. I don't know how to explain it.
So one way to help understand those two crisscrossing kind of like surfboard shapes is to consider these two objects flanking them on either side. Do you see those big, I don't want to tell you what they are. What are these two gold and kind of white objects that are vertical on either side of the middle?
They kind of look like double-sided mirrors or a light.
Right? Emily, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say they kind of look like magnifying glasses.
Yeah, I think that's what he's kind of going for. If you think about the importance of a lens, particular, a lens as something that either magnifies the microscopic world, as in a microscope, or a lens that magnifies the macroscopic world, as in the astronomical world beyond Earth. And so that, I think, really goes a long way in explaining what we're seeing there, because on one side, on one sort of, it's like the way a lens refracts an image, the sort of way a lens magnifies an image. Here we're looking at what looks to be like a petri dish, like microscopic organisms versus magnifying the cosmos, the sun, and so that's literally what I think we're looking at, sort of when we talk about the controller of the universe or person at a crossroads. It's sort of the crossroads of kind of technology and science, the godlike powers that we have to control, to manipulate nature, to understand nature, the scale of our ability to see into the microscopic and into the macroscopic gives us almost godlike abilities. And here's this person with at a joystick controlling this stuff, and it's almost like having all that power, like winning the lottery. It's like overwhelming, and I think maybe that's partly why this figure looks the way he does. But what about now, knowing that, you could say he's at a crossroads of science and technology being these sort of superpowers. But now, what do we see on the left versus the right? These two sides definitely represent two distinct political points of view. What do you think those are?
I feel like it's communism, I guess. capitalism, maybe.
Yeah, and what do you
Like,
see?
The right one is communism for sure because of the red.
Wait, so okay, so focus on that side first. Tell us about that side. What about it shows communism?
I would say the most like thing that shows communism is the red,
Right, the red, yeah,
the
absolutely
red,
the
and
red.
maybe the hats that people are wearing.
And notice, why is the sculpture beheaded?
Maybe because he disagrees with capitalism and thinks it
So,
doesn't work.
so one of the things with communism is it rejects religion, right? It's so
Oh,
and so I think what he's doing is he's showing sort of the statue is meant to represent Zeus or just the idea of a religion, and communism. Religion is the would be what does Marx say, something like the something for the masses or the food for the masses. I can't remember the exact quote, but basically like an opiate for the masses. So I think here Rivera is saying communism removes that opiate that kind of keeps people oppressed. Of course, that's very debatable. A lot of people would disagree with that, but it seems to be that Diego Rivera is saying that's a good thing. And would tell me, do you agree that it looks like he's saying that communism is the better choice, whereas capitalism on the left is negative? Anything on the left that says that seems to be a visually negative critique of capitalism?
I would say the people at the top, the military looking people with the masks.
Right. Yeah. So I think it seems pretty clear to me that he's offering sort of a world of two choices, and he seemed to be putting his flag on the sort of communist side, in terms of it's people marching, protesting. Maybe some people would say that's negative, cutting the head off of the god. But I think from Rivera's point of view, I think he's on the left showing that capitalism is very much about military, maybe brainwashing. You've got a figure being x-rayed, people maybe being entertained by television. In the middle, you notice down below, you've got like almost like industrial agriculture. But I think what's so interesting, I would love to have Diego Rivera join in our Zoom call right now and tell us, how and talk about the world today and how he would, because in a way, I love this picture because it really goes to show that the world in the 1930s really had this real stark choice between like very different worldviews of communism versus capitalism. Maybe today people might have a little less sort of a black and white view. Maybe some people would say you can have a blend of both. And maybe even socialism is more rearing its head more than ever. But this is certainly before the Cold War. So, you might look at communism differently after the Cold War, just knowing how the Soviet Union collapsed and other things, especially if you're from Venezuela, you might have a different take on communism than if you're, someone in Western Europe or Sweden. But certainly at this time in the world, I think a lot of people didn't know necessarily what was going to be the future, whether it was capitalism or whether it was communism or something else like Nazism and fascism. So it seems like Diego Rivera is kind of offering a really wonderful illustration of this choices facing people. Even after the Nazis are destroyed, you still have this sort of almost anticipating the Cold War. But I think it's up for you to decide, do you think is there something inherently warlike with capitalism? Well, I think if you look at what's going on right now, you could make an argument that yes, there could be an element of, military industrial complex wanting to sell more tanks and more weapons, and war is just another way to make more profit. I think you could also argue that, United States, you have a lot of innovation and technological innovation that you could say maybe offsets some of the negative sides of capitalism. But I think, again, on the right side, you really feel a sense of maybe unity. Down below, you see Karl Marx and Trotsky. So, maybe to a degree, some of this is dated, but at the same time, it's sort of a vision of the world that's either materialistic or maybe, individualized or collective. But certainly this outrages the Rockefellers when they wake up one morning, get their coffee at the local diner and walk into Rockefeller Center and see Vladimir Lenin painted on the wall instead of what we were supposed to get, which is something like this. And I love this mural because it's so, it has all of that sort of the classic Rivera, all these people, but with this very powerful emotional center with this sort of ambivalent figures, almost looks like a truck driver. Not certain, this is almost like how I feel about the future today in the world. I feel very much like this figure in the middle. Any other comments on this? There's so much more you could go over with this picture. Any other things that maybe any other? I love this two, the X in the middle with the just the way he painted the solar system or the microscopic world. I'd love to see more like this from Diego Rivera. Any other comments? Definitely a critical view of America. Definitely a big thumb in the eye of the Rockefellers to include subject matter that it wasn't approved of. Yes, Maggie.
I would also like to point out how it almost kind of looks like an atom, like just right there in the middle with that little round. I'm not really sure what that is that the hand in the center is holding, but with
Yeah,
the
yeah. That's
circular.
yeah, that's a great point. Is that like God's hand? Is that meant to be like kind of control? It looks like some kind of gauge and dials, but yeah, I get I like the interpretation. It's like an atom. That's like the center kind of that the unifying denominator between, you know, the macro and the cosm and the microcosm. And yeah, he did add that hand as sort of more the focal. You could say that's the real focal point. And it also looks like kind of like a face that's freaking out, doesn't it? Kind of like a screaming face. On a, like a or crystal ball. I like that interpretation, like a crystal ball, the future, and yet it's just gauges and dials. It seems like a more critical view of technology than his previous paintings. Not like a, you know, workers working together, but rather, you know, certainly he nailed the industrial farming, that like PVC piping down below. You know, this could be very
Yeah,
much
that.
like, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I just want to say that pipe kind of looks like a woman too.
Oh,
Maybe
interesting. The bottom, the very bottom.
yeah, like it kind of feel like the hair and the shirt.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. I see. I could see that
why?
sort
I
of.
don't know, but it kind of looks like that.
Yeah, yeah. And you notice he hasn't included Frida Kahlo. Usually we have a Frida Kahlo looking out at us or a flirtatious horse looking out at us. So, you know, maybe she's in there somewhere. Usually he puts her right in the middle somewhere. So she's not there. So that conspicuously absent Frida Kahlo. Maybe she's in there somewhere. But maybe that just, you know, again, him trying to, maybe he left her out because she doesn't maybe fit into this worldview that he's looking at. But definitely very critical and very more critical of technology. I think this is the repainted version that's in Mexico because this painting was destroyed by the Rockefellers. I mean, how cool would that be to have a piece of this? Man, if I had been one of the workers destroying the mural, I would have saved a few pieces. If I remember, after the Berlin Wall fell in New York City, people were selling pieces of the Berlin Wall. So you know, after 9/11, people were selling photographs of in Chinatown. They were immediately selling all these photographs of the World Trade Center building. So how cool would it be to have a piece of the Rockefeller mural? Hold on just a second. I gotta move something inside. So let me put a painting for you to look at for just a moment. Take a look at this. So maybe some details here, and give me just 1 second to bring something inside. I'll be right back. All right. Raining where you guys are. It started raining here. All right. Hopefully you guys are still there. So here's the I guess he documented some of his some of this because he knew it was going to be destroyed. But here's some pictures of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, very much kind of part of that New York social scene. Frida Kahlo has such a wonderful sense of fashion. Even Diego Rivera, I like his tie there. I think he loved New York, and she famously didn't. Look at that ice cream cone she's eating. It's so funny. Such a perfect picture of a couple that's sort of it's maybe estranged to a degree. You know, again, he cheated on her with a tennis player in the United States. So, you know, that definitely estranged them while they're in the United States. But again, he has a very important impact on America and the United States in terms of inspiring Franklin Delano Roosevelt to pay artists to create murals, like you see here in the Coit Tower in San Francisco. And I think you can almost, it looks almost like you're looking at a Diego Rivera painting. I don't want to spend too much time looking at it, but clearly a big influence on American muralism as far as a sort of what you expect, I think, from more conventional murals, kind of galvanizing, crystallizing a sense of community, of national identity. And, as far as cross-pollination, this is definitely the, wonderful example of the Mexican muralists influencing American artists to kind of paint their way out of depression and to crystallize that sense of national identity. I like this one a lot more. It's got more brushstrokes. There's something about the use of depth that really is powerful here. But again, these are not Diego Rivera's. These are paintings by muralists in San Francisco, inspired by Diego Rivera's work. So what are we looking at here? Anyone know what house this is? I don't know if you guys remember, Frida Kahlo grew up she has a blue house, that's the famous blue house, Casa Azul, I think, in Mexico City. So I'm assuming that the Frida Kahlo section of this house is on the right. And this is the house they built, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, when they got back to Mexico, probably with some of the earnings from the Rockefeller Commission. And what do you notice about the house? Any comments? Any observations? What a beautiful array of cactuses. You might notice, well, there's two separate houses. So the famous book by Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, like if you're in a relationship, both partners need to sort of have a room of their own. Well, in the case of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, they each have a house of their own. And you would think, oh, this would create maybe this is the perfect visualization of a happy marriage. So each has their own independence, but they're connected by this causeway. Well, sadly, this apparent marital bliss, it will be interrupted, as we'll see. But first, this is the mural we had seen earlier with the addition that he makes after returning from Mexico. So let me ask you, do you see much influence from the United States? So here is in 1935, after he's been in the United States, he's returned to Mexico. Do you see much influence from his trip to the United States on his painting here? Does it look like his work has changed that much?
I think I do see some change.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. There's something definitely that's changed. It's subtle, right? It's almost maybe more subtle than maybe I don't have the right kind of my antenna isn't tuned well enough. I'm just trying to figure out, maybe he's playing with scale to a degree. He has to kind of make it look kind of like the rest of the mural that he had already painted. So I think he's somewhat limited by having to make it not too different than everything else that he had already painted. But at the same time, there's maybe a little more movement, a little more kind of, it's foreshortening perhaps, but still, I think it's still kind of, he goes back to kind of crowding a lot of people together. You've got Frida Kahlo there down below. There he is, there she is. And, maybe it's not so much, this painting isn't about Mexican history so much as perhaps kind of, maybe he's focusing more on this is kind of like man, center of the universe, or controller of the universe, maybe, but updating that for Mexico, this sort of maybe the promise of Karl Marx and communism pointing the way forward. So this is maybe just something that is him completing what he had already started years before. But I think that would be a great thing to write about. Sort of what in this painting, what about it shows the influence of the United States? Because it seems to me that Orozco had a lot more, the United States had a lot more impact on Orozco than on Rivera to a degree, except for the fact that Rivera's painting murals transform while he's in the United States. But let's look at some more of his work and you tell me. So, here's the detail of some of the negative forces of presumably of capitalism. Greed would certainly be one, maybe, commodification, alienation. There's a lot of good criticism of capitalism for sure. And I think he's tackling some of those here. Karl Marx, he wrote the Communist Manifesto, thinking that, the world is kind of almost inevitably going to become communist because that's a natural progression away from capitalism. So it looks like he's sort of telling the worker and the soldier and the farmer, the campesino, that capitalism is the future. And you could see the swastika, the dollar bill. And do you guys know what that third symbol is there? I'm looking at the lower left middle. There's a swastika, which is the Nazi symbol. It looks like it's
Oh, I know what that is. That's the fasci. That's the a symbol used during the Italian during Mussolini's reign in Italy.
Great. Yeah. And you might look on, if you have a dollar bill and you open it up, you often see the symbol in fascism. You said fasci. Yeah. It's basically the idea is a collection of sticks is much stronger. You can't, if you take a bunch of sticks and you put them together, you can't break it versus an individual stick you can break. So this symbol, I think, goes all the way back to ancient Rome. And it's just a visual way of symbolizing or a way of visualizing unity and the strength of unity. And so the word fascism comes from the word fasci, like Milton said. So in a way, you could see, well, not in a way, you do see Rivera showing you swastika, capitalism, and fascism as sort of three possibilities. So in a way, I think this painting is kind of a similar to the man at the crossroads or man controller of the universe. But of course, here it's a little different composition. But I think these are the three possibilities that he sees as sort of the future and future of technology under capitalism or Nazism or fascism. Very depressing view of the future, if you ask me. Of course, I think the biggest criticism of Marx is, well, he didn't understand the importance of globalization. Now you get every piece of your clothes you wear might be made in a different part of the world. You get this part from here, get this part from there. And it's very hard to have a sense of a unified kind of economic resistance to a globalized world of capitalism, because everything's it's like an octopus with tentacles everywhere. But that wasn't really necessarily the case in the 1930s. The world absolutely wasn't globalized the way it is now. And who knows where that's going to lead us all, hopefully good places. But with Diego Rivera, this is the time when I think the strain on his relationship with Frida Kahlo reaches a real fever pitch. And I think she responds to his infidelity. This is when he cheats on her with her wife, her sister. Sorry. So, that is a real, it's one thing to cheat on your partner, but another thing to cheat on your partner with another family member, which is not too.
Well, it's like a betrayal from two people.
Yeah, like a two-front betrayal. And it just really makes me wonder, if someone said to me like, well, I just couldn't resist, hitting my head with a brick. I was just holding the brick and the brick was there and I just couldn't resist just smashing my face in with a brick. That's for me the same thing as saying, well, I couldn't resist cheating on my wife with her sister. Like, well, but you can resist hitting your face with a brick, right? So why? So is it just your sexual urges are such that you're willing to just destroy everything? And I really do wonder about this sort of element of kind of self-sabotage. I'm sure you can't, of course, excuse the sister from her role in this. But you really have to wonder, like, like I can stop myself from hitting my face with a brick. I can resist that urge. And yet Diego Rivera is like, I'm just going to hit my face with a brick. And, as you know from your reading, he went to the doctor in order to get an excuse for his infidelity, as if it's some sort of congenital or not, congenital, condition that he is sort of womanizing or sleeps around. And, that is already bad enough. But then to sleep around with Frida Kahlo's sister is just such a, you wonder, does that voice in Diego Rivera's head turn off selectively? What other things is he unable to sort of not have self-control about? And can you just imagine being Frida Kahlo? It's when you're married to someone, you're to a degree, you're sort of, that trust is the only thing that keeps you from feeling trapped, right? You're sort of, that trust should be the wings you soar on, so that even when you're, inhabiting the same place, maybe you can go to the other building and feel a sense of independence. But then if you don't have trust, who knows what's going on in the other building? And of course, I think Frida Kahlo literally walked in on Diego Rivera and her sister, in the midst of passionate lovemaking. So that's just it's the stuff of soap operas, right? But I really find it so hard to ignore that, and when I make my estimation of Diego Rivera as a sort of artist, as a person, especially because Frida Kahlo is such a powerful force of nature, a talented artist, that it's just sort of, it's just really hard for me to understand how he could, especially after taking this trip together to the United States, you'd think okay, now you've built this foundation. Now you build your castle on that foundation, and everything should be good. And yet Diego Rivera decided to kind of take a big risk and maybe was surrendered to his passions. But I feel like that's such a cheap justification. That's something like he would say, like, "Oh, I just surrendered to my passion." No, you just sort of set your house on fire. That's what you did. I don't know. Any comments on that? I mean, I don't think it's. I think we all sympathize with Frida Kahlo, and it's really hard to find any sympathy for Diego Rivera, especially knowing that he's going to the doctor looking for, a justification, a doctor's note to explain away his infidelity. I don't know if you remember that from your reading.
I was gonna say, I mean, he could just have been ego tripping.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just funny to think that ego, there's in a way like there's short-term ego, there's long-term ego, and there's mid-term ego, and that short-term ego is the one you got to watch out for, right? Because there's a sort of, yeah, short-term, I get sort of, delayed gratification does seem like a very powerful way of kind of preserving your sense of long-term freedom, independence, autonomy. When you can control your own urges, you can kind of control your own destiny. So, it definitely seems to have created a more toxic environment for their sort of matrimonial bliss, because she cheats on him with Trotsky. And that's kind of like, cheating on your partner with Che Guevara. It's like definitely a big, and I guarantee Diego Rivera was the kind of guy who's like, I'm going to get a doctor's note for my cheating, but if Frida cheats on me, that's unacceptable, kind of thing. And you all know about stories where someone thinks it's okay for them to cheat, but when the other person does it, it's oh my God, different standards, right? So I think she definitely cheats on him with Trotsky, not so much because she necessarily has found a substitute for Diego, so much as her knowing that this will really, be like a great way of getting back at him, strike straight at the heart. Trotsky, as you know, is a famous leader from the Soviet Union. Here he is next to, well, not next to Stalin. Stalin's here in the middle. Trotsky is way over there on the left, I think, showing you the growing divide between the two of them. Stalin's consolidating power. I'd like to know more about that dog myself, the dog that's leading the march. Is that dog a good communist or capitalist? But moving forwards, this looks like Siqueiros here. And I wonder about this. I got to look up a little more about this, because I know Siqueiros was one of the people involved with the assassination of Trotsky. So I don't know if that estranged relations with Diego Rivera or not. But it does seem like, Frida Kahlo hooked up with Trotsky, and, imagine being Trotsky's wife. There she is. And her husband's hooking up with Frida Kahlo. That's as bad as, your wife hooking up with Che Guevara or Trotsky, just, and all these famous celebrities. And, probably it was incredibly awkward. You could like cut the awkwardness with a knife whenever these people were hanging out with each other. Here's Trotsky with Frida Kahlo, and another picture. So, it really seems like Diego Rivera sabotaged a relationship, and, he already had cheated on Frida Kahlo, but now he's cheated on her with her sister. I think I have a picture of her here. Hold on just a moment. Yeah, there she is. So, it looks like I'm guessing these are Christina's children. Frida Kahlo couldn't have children because of her bus accident. So, I think that's why she often had a lot of pets and different things to kind of into which to pour her sense of maternity or motherhood, or just, feeling like you have responsibility over another creature. I think in a way, to her, Diego Rivera is kind of like a big child. In fact, he paints himself as a child in a lot of his paintings. So, I don't want to spend too much time on Frida Kahlo, because we'll look at her more when we look at our artwork by herself. But really, she's definitely kind of putting on some of the masquerade of wearing, I think, Diego Rivera's clothing here. But we'll look at this painting when we look at Frida Kahlo by herself. But I do want to remind you, you see this background of a sort of simplified horizon with a stormy sky. Remember that as we move forward, because we'll be looking at another painting that has that similar backdrop. So as far as, the backdrop, this is, again, United States good neighbor policy. They think they invite Diego Rivera back to San Francisco to make another mural. And here's one of I think the last murals he makes in the United States. I think he's opening up the space a little more. You notice Frida Kahlo is back in the picture there on the lower left. So I think he's trying to really, he's probably, please, I'm so sorry, please. And that's what that is right there. Please take me back, kind of thing. And it's God, can you imagine being Frida Kahlo, and having like what humiliation to force her into that position where she sort of has to like, pinch her nose and maybe accept, because they do remarry eventually. But I think he's including her in this painting probably as an olive branch. And definitely is one of my favorite inclusions of Frida Kahlo in the full mestiza glory. And I love the centerpiece here, the Tlaloc or Coatlicue, like Aztec god kind of raising his hand at you. And apart from that, I still don't feel like Diego Rivera is taking many more risks. He's opened up the space a little bit. I feel like there's not as many, it's different when you're illustrating Mexican history for Mexicans versus narrating American history for an American audience. I don't think he has the same obligation to be thorough and comprehensive. And of course, this isn't for illiterate Americans, so it's really a different animal. And I think it's more about how he sees America. And I don't see as much technology here. I think that is, of course, the unifying image. One unifying image is technology. But in a way, it's like work. And of course, on one side, you do see a little bit of Mexico. So maybe he's trying to bridge the two worlds. But there's still not much emotional connection for me, except maybe with Frida Kahlo looking out at us. And, I do think there's another example of a mural that I think achieves this a lot better. So let's go ahead to that, unless anyone has any comments about this one, because I want to show you, I think, what's my favorite mural by Diego Rivera. And we could spend all day on a lot of this stuff. I mean, look at how much detail there is. That carving is very interesting. It looks almost like a seahorse. And here they are reacquainted. I think she takes a train to San Francisco, they make amends and they get remarried. And, whether or not Frida Kahlo ever talked to her sister again, I don't know. Trotsky ends up being assassinated. And this is right on the eve of World War II with Hitler. I think by now, I think it's 1940, has already invaded Paris. So the world is at fever pitch war. And Diego Rivera, again, his interest in celebrating Aztec history. I think the best example of that has this museum he creates where all of his kind of collection of unearthed Aztec art is, honored by putting it all into a museum. And again, I think that's one of the best things that I love about Diego Rivera is how much he uses his painting to sort of resurrect the past and unerase the history that was erased by the Spanish conquest. And if only that is what Diego Rivera contributes, that's more than enough for me. Because Orozco really wasn't someone who embraced, and I don't even think you don't have to. Diego Rivera is not necessarily romanticizing the past so much as I think wanting to just include it into the historical memory of Mexico and include it as part of Mexican identity. And so he has a lot more of an interest in literally, resurrecting the past in physical form here, as you can see the collection of objects and in the back. And how cool would that be to live somewhere where you could actually find go out into your backyard and dig up the past and really, of course, maybe today he might get in trouble by not just immediately putting these things into the museum, but to have this as a source of inspiration when we get to Frida Kahlo. I think she definitely benefits from having all these really wonderful things to inspire the imagination when you're painting. And here is my favorite mural by Diego Rivera. Although I think the Detroit mural, the Man at the Crossroads, and this one are my favorite. I like his smaller work as a whole a lot better too, or differently. But I think this is my favorite one. And not to necessarily ask you to explain why I like it, but what about this one is a little different perhaps than other murals that we've seen? Let me get a little closer here. Show you a few more details. He does have a lot of people, right? They are definitely kind of shoulder to shoulder, but there's a few things that are a little different about this one. Maybe not major differences, but subtle and significant. Any observations from you guys? it's very wide. Well, one thing, for instance, is everyone's kind of facing the audience in a sort of, I mean, I think in the other cases that people were looking outward to a degree, but there's something about this part here where they're really kind of, I feel grounded. Like in some cases, we're up in the air, floating in the sky. I don't know if the viewer is meant to be grounded on the ground, same level as these figures. Whereas this one, it really feels like he's made a very executive decision to have everything on one surface on the ground. And so I feel as a viewer, I'm kind of part of this parade, part of this environment. And there's no sort of division of places, and there's no sort of surreal sort of or places that aren't just this location, which is the Alameda Park. So in a way, everything inhabits the same environment. So the lighting is all sort of real, and everyone's on the same level. There's no sort of bizarre leaps of depth or composition here. Everything's grounded. And there's something fun about it's the when he focuses on more of the festivities like fiesta. There's something really fun about that. I feel like that's definitely where he feels like most willing to enjoy color. And I almost feel like Diego Rivera's work is most interesting when he's not trying to kind of be critical or sort of be true to being sort of provocateur, but rather when he's just celebrating the things he loves. And I think that's really what's going on here. He's celebrating, he's showing himself as a child. Frida Kahlo's behind him, a reference to Posada, the cartoonist. There's Jose Marti in the back, the Cuban leader of Cuban independence, and all kinds of other aspects of Mexican history you see here. I love this. This just reminds me of the end of Titanic when everyone sort of appears for this sort of curtain call and they applaud Jack and whatever, I can't remember the name of the Jack and Rose and Jack. So, this feels like a really fitting kind of goodbye or a final sort of mural by Diego Rivera, which really celebrates Mexican history while also very, I think, personalizing all this for Diego Rivera. What do you guys think? Do you like this? The colors are wonderful in the backdrop. There's a nice sense of depth that really recedes away. It's not so chock full of, it's not like a crash course in history, as you guys pointed out. Any comments on this? It's not a very emotional still for me. It still feels very somewhat kind of like it's more an illustration rather than a expression like you would find with Orozco. If you don't have any comments on this, I want to focus on the final mural that he makes and compare it to the final painting he makes and compare it to the final painting by Frida Kahlo. Right after we look at this one, I think Maggie had asked about the backdrop. So you could see these are, I think, references to some other paintings he's made. And Diego Rivera is this really unflinching self-portrait. He's not glamorizing himself. He's not making himself look pretty. He's really sort of, owning his own appearance. He's not adding any Aztec garments or adding any sort of folklore. He's really sort of very matter of fact, looking right at you, very penetrating gaze. And for me, it looks like those trees are like straight out of the Parque Alameda. But now let's end by looking at here, and here he makes the cover of Time magazine. I can't remember what year this is. This is the final painting he made. And here's a final painting by Frida Kahlo. This is in 1954, the year she died. And Diego Rivera died in 1957, so only 3 years after she died, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Often when one of the partners dies in a long marriage, the other partner really loses their sort of their compass in life. So it's not unheard of that the two partners don't kind of meet each other in the hereafter with much time in between them. So, but let's compare these two. So here's a Frida Kahlo painting of watermelons, and here's a Diego Rivera painting. Well, any comments on on how the two compare? Because we're looking at similar subject matter, but there's some subtle differences between the two. What are some of those differences? Here's again the Frida Kahlo. Now, I think watermelon is a great choice for painting because you have those complementary colors, the red and the green. It's a great food to eat while you're painting, so you can cut it up and eat, and it's visually wonderful. It's a good choice for a subject to paint. That said, what do you think, Angela? Yes.
Um, uh, Diego Rivera feels a lot more casual, more relaxed, and Carlos is more like staged.
What do you mean by that?
Also,
Explain that with in terms of what you see here. Where do you get
like
that casual?
I guess the angle that it's set down at, that they're looking down at like a table full of watermelon, and they're eating it.
Right. So you notice you've spotted on something that I was definitely observing, that we're slightly above the table, looking down, kind of like as if you're sort of normal, what you'd expect from, distance from us to the table. Whereas, what about in Frida Kahlo's case, Angela?
Um, we're at like the same level. Also there's like not as much uh going on in the background.
Right. So you notice we're much closer to the watermelon here.
Yeah.
And these subtle choices really, for me, say a lot about, you know, either the personality of the person in the moment when they painted it, but generally also kind of generally about the artist's two different approaches to maybe the same subject. Um, you notice she really brings us, we're like right on the table, so almost so personal. It's very close. We're right there, like really like in the like on the table with the watermelon, not looking down at it. Whereas we're above, kind of like the watermelon is now like pieces of food we can pick up, and it looks like you cut the watermelon in half, cut another piece in half, displayed it all, and it's maybe chewing on another piece, but he's very much put everything on display. And she did too. But you notice one piece is really floating in the air. We almost have a sense of time, kind of a clock going around the middle. That for me, the watermelon's much more expressive here. I'm terrified of that piece on the left, like I'm going to fall into this kind of almost like a black hole, kind of watermelon innards. What about the backdrop? Someone else. What about her backdrop is different than Diego Rivera? Remember what I was saying a moment ago about her having this sort of very basic horizon and then this stormy sky? We'll see a lot of that in her work. I think that makes it much more personalized than Diego Rivera, who's sort of painting the watermelon as is in a room, maybe with a picture in the background, which is interesting because you can't see what's in the picture, of course. But in her case, she's almost made it more personalized by including it, like putting it into her own sort of visual vocabulary of this horizon line with a stormy sky, or at least cloudy sky, very expressive sky in the background. And of course, her including her signature just adds a whole nother level of kind of, like I don't know what you want to call that, like she's not trying to be very fussy and pretty, but gives herself permission to add writing. Whereas I don't really see Diego Rivera as necessarily someone who would add, a signature that's so big to the painting. Anyone like the Diego Rivera watermelons? Any merits to this one versus the other one?
I think Diego's has more of a like a narrative, obviously, because it has such a setting to it, whereas Frida's is more abstract and more surrealist. So you
Yeah,
have
yeah, great. Go on. Sorry.
it's just more of a personal and almost psychological in some ways, whereas again Diego is just so obsessed with formality and romanticizing his subjects that you kind of inherently have a narrative that you automatically follow when you're looking at it.
Yeah, and that's a great way of describing, like delineating, differentiating between the two of them. Him kind of focusing on maybe the believable environment, some kind of setting that this watermelon occupies, versus, like you said, more surreal kind of, yeah, surreal view of this watermelon. The watermelon's now in this sort of surreal landscape and narrative. Yeah, almost like you feel like, a different kind of narrative. In his case, he cut the watermelon in half and split it into two pieces so he could kind of put those there and fit on the table. Whereas I don't think Diego Kahlo is so concerned with kind of, laying things out, as it were. I think she probably painted one watermelon in different places, but not necessarily all sharing the table together. My favorite part is those little triangles on the outer part of the watermelon facing us. how she made that green so brown, and yet you can almost don't you don't even see it as brown because you understand that green kind of looks brown when you kind of consider the shadows, but also just the way that those pieces or the four triangles or five triangles like hands that kind of curve away from us. It's just such a wonderful abstract moment, and she just delights in some of these kind of textures and in a way that I don't necessarily see. I mean, I don't. I love Diego Rivera. I love his painting, but I think you really see two different approaches to painting that are so wildly and wonderfully different. And I think these watermelon 2 degrees show a little bit of that. Um, you could probably read a lot more into this, maybe some sexual reading into it. But definitely, a good segue to Frida Kahlo, who we'll be focusing on next, and who really kind of adds another sort of supplements all this sort of our learning about this very interesting early 20th century period of art making, because there's so much going on from the Mexican Revolution to the Soviet Revolution to World War I and World War II and technology. And all this mural making culminates with this very simple picture of a watermelon on a table. Of course, the murals are much more ambitious in scope, and of course, Frida Kahlo is not a mural maker, so we're going to be kind of moving away from muralism briefly before we get back to Siqueiros. But again, because Frida Kahlo's life overlaps with the same period we're looking at, it's only going to enhance your sort of understanding of these challenges and kind of opportunities facing these artists at this time of kind of global reckoning with capitalism and communism and technology and science and all that. So Frida Kahlo, or sorry, Diego Rivera doesn't die very long after Frida Kahlo. And people say he aged very quickly after she died. And yeah, I think anyone's married to Frida Kahlo, that when she's gone, the absence is going to be really hard to fill, even with painting or anything else. So I imagine he felt a lot of guilt about his infidelity. I'd like to know more about that, but I certainly would think he probably beat himself up quite a bit those last few years, knowing that he just probably added suffering to Frida Kahlo's life, which is already filled with so much suffering.